He gave her everything she never asked for. Stolen nights, whispered promises, the warmth of a man who ruled the known world. Then morning came, and Emperor Vaelor Drax handed her a purse of gold like she was a debt he'd finally settled. Seris Vale walked out of that palace with nothing but her dignity and a secret that would one day bring an empire to its knees. This is not a love story. This is a survival story. Stay until the end. You won't see that ending coming. Hit like, drop your city in the comments, and let's get into it. The purse hit her palms the way bad news always does, suddenly, and with a weight that felt wrong for its size. Seris Vale stood in the center of Emperor Vaelor Drax's private chambers and stared at the leather pouch sitting in her hands. The drawstring was pulled tight. The coins inside clinked once, softly, like a whisper too ashamed to speak above itself. She could feel the heat still radiating from the silk sheets behind her. She could still smell him on her own skin. The candles had burned low, but not out. They hadn't been together long enough for that. And the gray light pushing through the tall iron-framed windows told her dawn was maybe an hour away. Maybe less. She did not move. Vaelor had his back to her now, his broad shoulders squared beneath the white linen shirt he'd drawn on with the practiced efficiency of a man who dressed himself in darkness 1,000 times before. His dark hair was loose, still slightly disheveled, and he was lacing the cuffs of his shirt with the same focused calm he brought to war councils. As if the act of fastening each button were simply another item on the morning's agenda. As if she were simply another item on the morning's agenda. That should be sufficient. His voice was even, not cruel, not warm, just precise, the way a blade is precise. More than sufficient, if you're sensible about it. Seris's fingers closed slowly around the purse. She looked at the back of his head. She had threaded her fingers through that hair 6 hours ago. She had felt him press his forehead against hers and breathe like a man surfacing from water. She had believed, God help her, she had believed that meant something. Vaelor, the escort will take you to the eastern gate before the morning watch changes. He moved to the writing desk now, pulling on the dark outer coat that had been folded across the chair's back. You should be outside the capital walls before the household staff begins their rounds. Vaelor, look at me. He paused, just for a moment. Then he picked up the coat and turned, and the man looking at her from across the room was not the man who had held her 3 hours ago. That man had been present in some way she couldn't quite name, cracked open, as if being near her had taken something loose in him that he spent the rest of his life keeping bolted shut. This man had his eyes sealed back over whatever that was. His face was composed, his jaw was set. He looked at her the way he looked at documents that required his signature, with attention, but without investment. It's better handled cleanly, he said. Better for who? For both of us. Seris looked down at the purse in her hands. She turned it once, felt the coin edges shift and settle. Then she looked back up at him. I'm not a debt you've cleared, Vaelor. Something moved through his face, fast and then gone. That's not what this is. Then tell me what it is, in plain language. Tell me what last night was. He said nothing. She waited. Outside, somewhere far below, she could hear the distant sound of the night guard's boots crossing the inner courtyard. Steady. Unhurried. The palace had its rhythms and its routines, and the world inside it simply did not stop for whatever was happening in this room. That struck her as terribly honest. I see, she said at last. Seris, I said I see. She said it quietly. Not with anger, which surprised her. Anger would come later. What she felt in this moment was something flatter and colder, the specific feeling of seeing clearly for the first time after a long period of looking at something sideways. I understand what this is now. I want you to know that I understand. What I offered was generous. You're not in a position to... I know exactly what position I'm in. She crossed the room without hurrying, walked past the bed and past him, set the leather purse down on the writing desk beside his hand, and turned for the door. Keep it. Don't be foolish. She stopped with her hand on the carved stone doorframe. She didn't turn back. I've been many things in this palace, Your Majesty. Foolish isn't one of them. I am leaving. I don't need an escort. I don't need your coin. And I don't need you to remember my name with guilt either. I'd rather you forgot it entirely. She heard him exhale through his nose, short, sharp, the sound of a man who hadn't been refused in so long he'd almost forgotten how it felt. She walked through the door before he could find the language for it. The corridor beyond was cold and lamplit, and her feet made no sound on the stone. She was good at that. Years of palace service had trained her to move like a curtain shifts in a closed room, present and then not, without anyone being able to say exactly when the absence began. She kept her spine straight and her breathing shallow, and she did not let herself feel the full weight of what had just happened until she had cleared the servants' passage at the north end of the hall and was crouched in the supply alcove behind the linen room where nobody ever came before fifth bell. Then she pressed her back against the cold stone wall and sat with her knees drawn up, and she felt it. It moved through her in waves. Not tears, not yet. That would take a few days more, when the body finally surrendered the last of its protective numbness. What she felt now was closer to grief that hadn't yet decided what shape to be. A dense, spreading ache behind her sternum, like something had been removed that she'd assumed was permanent, like she'd put her hand out for something that had always been there and found empty air. She pressed her palm flat against the wall and breathed. She had known what Vaelor Drax was. She had known it the first time she'd ever been close enough to observe him, not from across a hall with hundreds of courtiers between them, but close, in one of the smaller side corridors where she'd been carrying a stack of folded linen and he'd been walking fast in the opposite direction, alone for once without his trailing guard, some piece of news clearly working its way through him. He'd glanced at her. Most nobles didn't. Not really. Servants became part of the architecture after a while, just obstacles to root around without eye contact. But he had glanced, and then he had actually looked, just for a moment, and she had seen something in his face that she hadn't expected. Not desire, not the casual entitlement of a man accustomed to taking what he wanted. Something more confused than that, something that looked almost like recognition, though that made no sense. She had lowered her eyes immediately and stood aside, and he had passed without a word. She had told herself she'd imagined it. She hadn't imagined the 3 times after that, when she'd found him in corridors where he had no particular business being, or the evening 4 months ago when he'd dismissed his attendants and spent an hour in the West Library, where she'd been cataloging the winter inventory, asking her about herself in the methodical, slightly halting way of a man who didn't often ask questions he didn't already know the answers to. She hadn't imagined the way he'd listened. The way the listening had seemed to cost him something. She hadn't imagined last night either. What it felt like. What he'd said. Not with words, because he was sparing with those, but in the spaces between them. The way he'd looked at her like she was something he couldn't afford to look at too long. But she had perhaps imagined what it meant. That was on her. Seris straightened up in the alcove, smoothed her dress, let herself breathe twice, evenly, the way her mother had taught her when she was small and frightened of storms. Not to push the fear out, but to make space for it so it didn't take up all the room available for thinking. She had until 5th bell. After that, the corridor traffic would increase enough to make her presence here conspicuous. She began to calculate. She had 14 months of wages saved. A palace attendant's pay wasn't much, but she spent almost nothing. No vices, no vanity beyond a second pair of boots when the first wore through, and she had been putting coin away with the quiet discipline of someone who had always understood that her circumstances were temporary, even when they felt permanent. 14 months of wages wouldn't last forever, but it would last long enough to find footing somewhere new. She had skills. Clean domestic skills, practical ones, the kind that didn't require her to explain where she'd learned them. She would leave. Not just this alcove, the city. She already knew where. Eld Hollow. 3 days south by road, hard against the mountains. She'd heard of it from another attendant who'd grown up there. A woman named Marin, who'd called it a place where people went to disappear and found instead that they'd arrived. She'd described it with the particular warmth of someone who'd left a place they loved because they needed to and hadn't quite forgiven themselves for it. Rough country, she'd said. Hard winters. The kind of community that minds its own business because everyone in it arrived carrying something they weren't going to discuss. Nobody asks where you came from. They only ask whether you can work. Seris could work. 5th bell rang somewhere above her in the tower. She stood up, adjusted the linen bundles she'd never actually delivered, stepped back into the corridor and walked toward the eastern servants' exit with the steady, purposeful gait of a woman who has somewhere to be. She did not look back. She never looked back. That was one of the last truly easy decisions she would make for a very long time. The road south in early winter was not a road designed for sentiment. It was a road designed to remind you that the land didn't particularly care about your circumstances. Seris had purchased passage on a trading cart heading toward the Eld province border. A taciturn driver named Polt, who smelled of livestock and charged half what she expected, apparently operating under the impression that fewer questions made for better arrangements, which suited her completely. The cart was loaded with salted grain and iron tools, and she rode on the back bench beneath a canvas tarp with her pack between her feet and watched the capital of Nareth recede into the cold horizon. She watched it until she couldn't distinguish the Black Palace spires from the gray winter sky anymore. Then she stopped watching. The journey took 4 days because a bridge was out on the second, and Polt knew a longer route that added half a day but kept the axle intact, and by the time the mountains of Eld came into full view against the northern sky, Seris had developed a precise and thorough understanding of what cold felt like in the narrow gap between a canvas tarp and an open cart bed. She had also had 3 days of continuous silence in which to understand something else. She was 7 weeks late. She had not let herself count the days precisely until now, because counting them precisely meant confronting what counting them precisely meant. 7 weeks. The timing was not complicated. There was no other explanation that didn't require constructing a very elaborate alternative reality, and Seris had never been a woman with patience for comfortable lies. What it was what it was. She sat with that knowledge as the mountains grew and the cold deepened and Polt's horses worked steadily southward, and she performed the internal arithmetic of her situation without allowing herself the luxury of panic. Panic was a response to feeling trapped. She was not trapped. She was in difficult circumstances. Those were different things, and the difference mattered. By the time the cart rolled into Eld Hollow in the last gray hour before dark, she had made 4 decisions. First, she would tell no one who the father was. Second, she would not return to the capital for any reason. Third, she would raise this child alone, and she would raise them well. Fourth, she would stop counting the ways in which her life had just fundamentally changed and begin counting instead the ways she was going to survive it. Maelin's Inn announced itself with warm light through thick shuttered windows and wood smoke curling up from 2 chimneys and the particular smell of roasting root vegetables that Seris would forever afterward associate with the feeling of having arrived somewhere safe. She climbed down from Polt's cart with stiff legs and a pack on her shoulder and pushed open the inn's front door and found herself standing in a low-ceilinged room thick with firelight and the murmur of perhaps a dozen locals who looked up at her arrival with the calm, measuring curiosity of people who'd seen plenty of strangers come through but retained the habit of assessing each one. Maelin herself was behind the long wooden counter, a woman of maybe 60, with the kind of face that had been handsome once and was now something better than handsome, settled and deeply lined and carrying an expression of practical, unsentimental kindness that Seris recognized immediately as the real kind, the kind that didn't require you to deserve it first. "Passing through or staying?" Maelin asked. "Staying," Seris said. "If there's work." Maelin looked at her for a moment, not unkindly, taking stock in the direct way of someone who had been running a place that served as a way station for people in various states of difficulty for long enough to read the important information at a glance. "There's always work," she said. "Room 7 copper a week, meals included on working days. I don't ask questions that aren't my business. You don't need to explain yourself to anyone here unless you choose to." "That suits me." "Thought it might." Maelin set a mug of something hot on the counter. "Drink that first. Decide in the morning." Seris sat down on the nearest stool, wrapped both hands around the mug, felt the heat travel up through her palms and into the cold center of her chest. "Thank you," she said. Maelin waved a hand as if to say gratitude was unnecessary, and went back to the work behind the counter, and the fire crackled and the locals went back to their conversation. And outside the mountains stood in their ancient indifference against the winter sky. And for the first time in 4 days, Seris's shoulders came down from where they'd been lodged against the base of her neck. She was going to be all right. She told herself that with conviction, the way she told herself everything that she needed to be true before she had evidence for it. Not wishful thinking. She didn't have the constitution for wishful thinking. More like deliberate installation. A belief she would build into herself through repetition until it calcified into fact. She was going to be all right. She repeated it all the way up the narrow staircase to the small room at the end of the hall. She repeated it while she unpacked her single change of clothes and her small folded store of coin and the stub of candles she'd had in her pack since she'd left. She was still repeating it, quietly and without sound, when she lay down on the narrow bed and stared at the low wooden ceiling and the candle guttered and the mountain dark pressed soft against the window. She repeated it until she fell asleep. She only stopped when she dreamed of him. Eld Hollow in winter was no place for soft commitments. The village occupied a bowl-shaped valley between three ridgelines, sheltered enough to be survivable, but exposed enough that every winter the mountains tested whether you'd prepared correctly and punished you without apology if you hadn't. The people who lived there were the kind of people that environment produces. Self-sufficient, honest in the blunt way of people who don't have time to maintain complicated social performances, and possessed of the specific generosity that communities develop when they understand that eventually everyone needs something from someone. Seris fit in the way she'd always fit in anywhere that asked of her only usefulness and gave in return only what was earned. Within 2 weeks, she was pulling full days at the inn, cleaning rooms, helping in the kitchen, carrying supplies, serving the dinner crowd. Caelen, it turned out, had a bad knee that had been giving her trouble for 3 years, and 2 adult children who'd left for the city, and a deeply realistic understanding of how much she could no longer accomplish alone. Seris filled that gap without being asked to, without drama, with the quiet competence that had always been her primary mode of existing in the world. The women of the village noticed her and made the specific, considered overtures of welcome that women in small communities extend to newcomers who've arrived alone and clearly have reasons they're keeping private. They did not push. They brought her food during the hard weeks of the second month, when mornings became something to endure rather than merely survive. And they said nothing beyond the practical when she thanked them. And when old Dina, who had delivered every child born in Eld Hollow for 30 years, came by the inn in the spring to check on her, she did so with the brisk, no-nonsense manner of someone who understood that what was needed was competence, not sympathy. "First one?" Dina asked. "Yes." "Father in the picture?" "No." Dina looked at her over the top of her spectacles with the expression of a woman who had been given that answer many times and understood all the different things it could contain. "All right then," she said simply. "We'll manage." It was, Seris reflected later, the correct thing to say. Not "we'll manage without him," or "it's his loss," or any of the other formulations people sometimes reached for, as if the situation required an editorial. Just, "we'll manage." Practical and direct and oriented entirely toward the future, which was the only direction worth looking. She managed. It was hard in ways she'd understood were coming, and in ways she hadn't. The loneliness was the most honest of them. Not loneliness for company, she had enough of that, but a specific kind of loneliness that had no name she knew. The loneliness of carrying information that would have changed everything if delivered to the right person, and choosing instead to seal it inside yourself and walk forward carrying its weight. Some nights it felt like she was hauling something enormous and invisible across a mountain pass that never ended. She thought about Vaelor on those nights more than she wanted to. Not with longing, not exactly. More with the complicated, ambivalent attention you give to something that has genuinely harmed you, while also genuinely mattering to you, and the refusal to simplify that tension into something cleaner than it actually was. He had dismissed her. He had reduced what had grown between them to a transaction and handed her the receipt. That was true. It was also true that she had seen who he was underneath the architecture of imperial composure, and that person had been real, whatever he'd chosen to do with the realness afterward. She didn't forgive him, but she also didn't spend energy hating him, because hatred was expensive, and she was working on a budget. She thought sometimes about whether she was making the right choice by saying nothing. She turned it from every angle. A child deserving to know their father. That consideration sat with her heavily some nights. But a child entering the orbit of Emperor Vaelor Drax would be entering a world of court politics and succession disputes, and the specific ruthlessness that power generated around itself like weather. She had seen what that world did to soft things. She had watched nobles' children grow up in it with their empathy systematically removed and their survival instincts sharpened until they were weaponized. She had watched people she liked become something harder and less themselves because that was what the court of Nareth demanded in exchange for survival. She would not send her child into that. The child was born in a brutal January storm, the kind that came over the eastern ridge and locked the valley down for 3 days with a cold that had teeth in it. Dana had come the afternoon before because she'd known the signs, and Malin had cleared the upper room and boiled water and kept the fire high. And somewhere in the small hours of the second day, in a room that smelled of wood smoke and pine resin and the clean copper smell of new life arriving in the world, Seris Vale brought her son into existence. He screamed once, loud and emphatic, as if announcing himself, and then settled into the alert, intent quiet of a baby who was already paying attention to what was happening around him. "There he is," Dina said, with the calm satisfaction of someone who'd midwifed 3 decades of Eld Hollow births and lost exactly 6 and never stopped feeling each one. "Look at those eyes." Seris looked, storm gray, dark and clear and direct, with that unsettling focus that some newborns have that makes you feel as though they're cataloging you rather than simply existing near you. She knew whose eyes those were. She felt something move through her chest that was too large and too complicated to name. Love was in it. Yes, enormous love, immediate and total, the kind that arrives without warning and rearranges the architecture of everything around it. But there was also grief in it, which surprised her. Grief for the completeness of what this small person deserved and what circumstances had denied him. Grief for the man who wouldn't know this moment existed. Grief for herself, a little. For the version of this that had lived briefly in her imagination before reality reasserted itself. She held him, and none of that grief touched her face. What was on her face was something that Malin, watching from the doorway, would describe later to her daughter in a letter as the look of a woman who has decided. "Caelen," Seris said quietly, not asked, said. The storm rattled the window. The fire threw its warmth. Her son made a small sound against her chest that seemed, to her, like agreement. The years that followed had the particular texture of hard work done in good faith. Caelen grew at the rate that children grow when they are fed well and loved consistently, and given room to develop their own relationship with the world without too much interference, which is to say, fast, and in directions that surprised her constantly. By 18 months, he was walking with the purposeful, slightly bow-legged determination of a toddler who has decided that crawling is beneath him. By 3, he was asking questions about everything with the relentless systematic curiosity of a small person conducting a serious inquiry into the nature of existence. Why did horses have 4 legs instead of 2? Why did bread rise and mud not? Why did the mountain look different at sunset than at midday? Why? Delivered with the focused intensity of someone who expected real answers and was disappointed by evasion. Seris gave him real answers. Always. Even when the answer was, "I don't know," she said it directly and suggested where they might find out. She had resolved very early that she would not raise a child on comfortable simplifications, because the world was not comfortable or simple, and a child taught to expect otherwise would be consistently ambushed by reality. He had his father's eyes and his father's bearing. There was no avoiding that, the way he already stood at 4 years old as if he owned whatever ground he was standing on, not with aggression, but with a kind of settled certainty, a fundamental absence of self-doubt that she recognized, and that made her feel complicated things she had gotten very good at not examining too directly. But he also had, and she held on to this fiercely, something that his father had apparently spent years working to destroy in himself. A gentleness. A genuine interest in other people's experience, not as data to be collected and used, but as something valuable in itself. He would sit for 20 minutes listening to old Dina describe what the valley had looked like 50 years ago. He brought Malin's cat in from the cold with the earnest determination of someone who took seriously the responsibility of noticing suffering in whatever form it appeared. When the innkeeper's son fell from a fence and cut his hand badly and cried in the way boys cry when they're embarrassed by their own crying, Caelen sat down next to him on the ground without being asked, and didn't say anything useful at all, just stayed there beside him until the crying ran out, which was, Seris thought watching from across the yard, perhaps the most useful thing possible. She did not tell him about his father, not yet. She had decided to give him roots first, an identity that wasn't built on that information. When he was older, old enough to carry it without being shaped by it before he had the frame for it, she would tell him the truth. All of it, because he deserved the truth and because she was not going to raise him on a foundation that had a hidden room in it. but not yet. For now he was just Caelen Vale, son of Seris, boy of Eld Hollow, child of mountains and wood smoke and winter storms, and the specific freedom of a life lived outside the reach of courts and crowns, and the terrible machinery of power. It was a good life. She meant that without irony. It was hard and small by certain measures, and it was hers, and it was his, and they had built it together in the specific way that parents and children build their worlds, imperfectly and continuously and with tremendous love for the imperfection. She almost let herself believe it was permanent. The morning everything changed had the irreverent normalcy of all days that later divide your life into before and after. The Eld Hollow Autumn Market came twice a year and transformed the village square from its usual compact functionality into something almost festive. Traders from the southern roads, craftspeople from the mountain communities, the particular energy of people who spent most of their time in relative isolation and arrived at the market with an appetite for novelty and human noise that no amount of commerce could entirely explain. Seris came because Caelen needed specific root vegetables and iron hinges, and Caelen came because he was 4 and it was impossible to leave a 4-year-old at the inn when a market was visible from the window. He held her hand with the focused grip of a child who had decided he would not lose her, which she knew from experience meant approximately nothing. He would see something interesting in the next 30 seconds, and the hand would go slack, and she would spend the subsequent 20 minutes tracking a small person through a crowd with her heart in her throat. She had bought the last of Maelin's list and was standing at the fruit seller's stall choosing winter pears with the concentration the task deserved. You had to feel for the right give, not too soft, not the false firm of an unripe one. When Caelen's hand went slack in exactly the way she'd predicted. She turned. He was 6 stalls away already, standing in front of a leather goods display with his head tilted at the particular angle that meant he was about to ask someone an extensive series of questions they hadn't agreed to answer. She moved toward him through the crowd, navigating around a group of traders arguing about road conditions, and past a woman managing a cart of woven blankets, and was maybe 20 feet from him when she felt it. The specific, unmistakable feeling of being watched. Not the generalized awareness of existing in a public space. Something more focused and more unsettling, a directional thing. The weight of a particular pair of eyes finding her in the crowd and staying there. She looked up. Across the market square, perhaps 40 feet away, standing slightly apart from a group of men whose bearing and weaponry identified them as escort rather than merchants, was a figure in dark riding clothes and a plain wool traveling cloak. Nothing about the clothes said anything. Everything about the posture said everything. She had spent almost 2 years in proximity to that posture. She knew how Emperor Vaelor Drax occupied space. She knew the specific set of his shoulders, the particular way he stood as if the ground under his feet existed as a courtesy rather than a necessity. The quality of stillness that wasn't stillness at all, but the concentrated attention of a man who processed the world entirely as information to be evaluated and responded to. He was looking directly at her. Their eyes met. She felt the color leave her face. She did not think. She reached Caelen in 4 fast steps, scooped his hand into hers with a grip that made him look up at her with wide, surprised eyes, and said, quietly and precisely, "We're going now." "But Now, Caelen." He heard the tone and complied without further argument, small legs working double time to keep up with her pace as she moved through the crowd in the opposite direction, keeping bodies between herself and the point where she'd seen him, not running. Running would be conspicuous. Running would confirm. But moving with the controlled urgency of someone covering distance while pretending not to be covering distance. She did not look back. Her heart was a fist against her ribs. She thought, he couldn't have recognized me. She thought, 4 years is a long time. I'm dressed differently. My hair is longer. She thought, he doesn't know about Caelen. He can't know about Caelen. She thought, he was passing through. His people are all over the Empire. It's coincidence. It's nothing. She thought all of this and kept walking and did not look back and knew, with the cold, clear certainty that had always been her most reliable instrument, that she was telling herself a story. She had seen his face in that moment. She had seen the exact instant his eyes moved from her to the small boy holding her hand. She had seen what happened to his expression when his eyes found those storm-gray eyes looking back at him out of a 4-year-old's face. She had seen recognition, not confusion, not uncertainty. Recognition, the immediate devastating kind, the kind that didn't need evidence because it was its own evidence. She turned a corner into the narrower market lane and pulled Caelen close and kept moving, and behind her, over the noise of the market crowd, she heard the sound that she had been dreading for 4 years. A single voice, low and controlled and carrying the quality of a man who'd never had to raise his voice to be obeyed. Seris. She stopped. Her hand tightened around Caelen's. The crowd moved around them like water around two stones. Caelen looked up at her with his father's eyes. "Mama, who's that man?" And that was the question, wasn't it? She could feel him behind her now. Not close enough to touch, not yet, but close enough that she could hear the particular quality of his breath in the cold morning air, controlled, deliberate. The breath of a man who had decided something. She turned around. Vaelor Drax stood 10 feet away, with his hood pushed back and his escort hanging back at a tactful distance, and his eyes moving between her face and Caelen's with the expression of a man who has just walked face first into the thing he had spent years not allowing himself to think about. His face was older than she remembered, harder in different places. But the eyes were the same, dark and relentlessly focused, and in them she could see something she had never once seen there before. The Emperor of the known world was afraid. "Tell me," he said. His voice was very quiet. "Tell me I'm wrong." Seris said nothing. The silence lasted a long time. Vaelor exhaled, a slow, careful breath that was the only sign he gave of what it had cost him to keep his face composed in this moment. He looked at Caelen, really looked at him, in the specific way of a man who had just understood something that was going to change everything, and who was still working out whether he intended to survive that understanding. When he looked back at Seris, his expression had shifted into something she couldn't read. Not anger, not the imperial authority she'd braced herself against, something rawer and more dangerous than either. "How old?" he said. She held his gaze and she kept her chin level, and she thought about the 4 years she'd spent building a life on a foundation of survival and silence and her son's safety. And she thought about the purse hitting her palms with its exact small weight, and she thought about the fact that whatever happened next was going to happen regardless because she had run out of the geography of avoidance. 4, she said. One word, barely above the noise of the market. Vaelor closed his eyes, and in the cold autumn air of Eld Hollow, with the mountain ridge standing witness above the faded market awnings and Caelen's hand warm and small inside hers, Seris Vale watched the most powerful man in the known world stand very still and come completely undone. She did not know yet whether that made her safer or whether it made everything infinitely more dangerous. She suspected, with the cold, clear certainty that had always been her most reliable instrument, that it was the latter. She was right. The market kept its noise around them like the world had not just shifted on its axis. Someone nearby was haggling over the price of smoked fish. A cartwheel needed grease and announced this fact loudly every few feet. Children ran between the stalls with the reckless velocity of small people who have not yet learned that speed and direction are separate considerations. All of it continued, indifferent and ordinary. While Emperor Vaelor Drax stood 10 feet from the woman he'd discarded 4 years ago and looked at the son he hadn't known existed and did something Seris Vale had never once seen him do in 2 years of quiet observation. He stood still without controlling it. There's a difference, and it matters. Every other time she'd seen him motionless, it had been a performance of stillness. The deliberate, weaponized calm of a man who had trained himself to project composure as a form of dominance. What she was looking at now was different. This was the stillness of a man who had simply stopped because the machinery that usually kept him moving had encountered something it had no protocol for. Caelen was looking up at him with the frank, assessing curiosity of a 4-year-old who has not yet learned that staring is considered rude and has no particular motivation to learn it quickly. "You're very tall," Caelen said. Vaelor's eyes moved to him. Something crossed his face that was too complicated and too fast to name. "Yes," he said. His voice came out even, which Seris suspected cost him something. "My mama is tall too, but not that tall." Caelen considered this. "Are you a soldier? You look like Polt's cousin who is a soldier. He has a sword." "Caelen," Seris said his name quietly. "I'm just asking." "I know. Come here." Caelen moved to her side without argument, which meant he had caught something in her voice. He was good at that. had always been sensitive to the frequencies adults used when they were managing fear without wanting it visible. He pressed against her leg and kept watching Vaelor with those storm-gray eyes that were, at this proximity and in this light, almost aggressively identical to the ones looking back at him. Vaelor exhaled slowly through his nose. He was working. She could see it, the interior labor of a man reassembling his architecture after something had knocked it sideways, pulling the pieces back into position through sheer force of will, because that was the only tool he trusted. "Walk with me," he said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't quite an order. It was the specific register of a man accustomed to giving commands who was making a deliberate effort to sound like something other than that and not fully succeeding. "No," Seris said. His jaw tightened. "I am not asking you to. I know what you're not asking me. The answer is no." She kept her voice level and her body between him and Caelen without making it look like that was what she was doing. "Not here. Not now. Not like this. Then when?" "When I decide." The silence that followed had a texture to it. Vaelor looked at her with the expression of a man who had just been told something by an equation he'd assumed was solved. And the expression was not anger, not yet, though anger was probably in the territory ahead. What it was adjustment, recalibration. The look of someone recognizing that the landscape had changed while he wasn't watching, and that the old maps were no longer reliable. There is something particular about what power does to a person's instincts when those instincts are challenged. It is not simple. A man who has commanded armies and courts and the administrative apparatus of an empire for 2 decades does not experience the word no the way ordinary men experience it. For Vaelor, no had become something almost theoretical, a concept that applied to situations involving other people, a word that existed in political negotiations and diplomatic correspondence but had no real purchase in the sphere of his personal will. The empire had shaped him that way, deliberately and systematically, because an emperor who accepts limitation is an emperor whose authority is already eroding. What Seris was watching on his face was the collision of that conditioning with a situation it couldn't metabolize. He needed something from her, and she was declining to provide it, and he had no mechanism for that. One of his escort had drifted closer, a big man with the flattened nose of someone who'd been in professional violence for a long time, and the watchful, weight-shifted posture of someone who was currently in professional violence. He hadn't closed the distance enough to be openly threatening, but he'd closed it enough to remind her that she was one woman in a public market, and the man in front of her had brought 6 of those. Vaelor glanced at the escort without turning his head. One small movement of his hand, dismissive and minimal. The escort drifted back. To Seris, it looked like a concession. She wasn't sure that was what it was. "Tonight," Vaelor said. "Name a place." "I don't know that you'll be here tonight." "I will be." She studied him, tried to find the angle, the calculation behind it, because there was always calculation behind it. That was what she'd learned about him, that even the moments that felt most unguarded had architecture behind them. This man did not simply react. He processed and deployed. The spontaneous and the strategic were always intertwined in him. But right now, looking at his face, she couldn't find the calculation. What she found instead was something that looked uncomfortably like desperation, wearing a very thin suit of composure. She thought, this is the most dangerous version of him. A Vaelor Drax who knows what he wants and has no leverage to take it is a Vaelor Drax capable of things that a comfortable Vaelor Drax might not reach for. She had seen enough of the court of Nareth to understand what happened to things that stood between emperors and what they decided they were owed. She thought, I need information before I give him access to anything. "The inn at the north end of the square," she said. "There's a room with a back entrance. I'll be there at 7th bell. Alone. I'll come with 2 men. You'll come alone or I won't be there." Another silence, longer this time. "Fine," he said. It came out flat and clipped, and she could tell it had cost him to say it, and she filed that information carefully. A man who finds it difficult to agree to small things will find the large ones nearly impossible. She already knew what the large thing was going to be, and she was beginning to understand that the conversation tonight was going to require everything she had. "Good," she said. She shifted Caelen's hand in hers and turned. 7th bell. She walked away. She did not look back. Behind her she heard nothing, but No footsteps following, no voice calling after her, just the market's ordinary noise reclaiming the air around the space where that conversation had happened. Caelen trotted beside her with his hand in hers, and after a moment said, "Who was that man, Mama?" "Someone I used to know." "Is he a bad man?" She considered that for the length of 3 stalls passing. "No," she said finally. "He's a complicated man, which is sometimes harder." Caelen processed this with the seriousness he gave everything. Harder than what? Than simple. He seemed to accept that, the way he accepted most of her answers, not as satisfying conclusions, but as data to be held and returned to later. He was already, at 4, a person who understood that understanding things took time. She picked up the last of Malin's order from the vegetable cart and paid for it and walked back to the inn with her spine straight and her pace even and her mind running the way it ran when she was managing something that required all of it. She had until 7th bell. 6 hours. She needed to think. The back room at Marate's Tavern, the inn she'd named, not Malin's place, she wasn't bringing this near Malin's place, was small and smelled of tallow and old wood and the accumulated memory of 100 private conversations that the walls had absorbed and kept. A single lantern on the table. 2 chairs. The kind of room where things were said that couldn't be said anywhere else. Seris arrived 20 minutes before 7th bell. She told Malin she was meeting an old acquaintance to discuss a business arrangement. Malin looked at her over the rim of her tea mug with the expression of a woman who had arrived at a very complete understanding of most things, through the simple mechanism of paying attention for 60 years, and said, "You want me to keep Caelen tonight?" "If you don't mind." "Already assumed." Malin set the mug down. "You know where the back exit is? From whenever it was you came in 3 nights ago, and I didn't ask about that either." Seris looked at her. "Thank you, Malin. Stop thanking me and go handle whatever this is." She went. She sat in the chair facing the door with the lantern at her back so the light would be in his eyes and not hers, because these were the small preparations you made when you were about to negotiate with someone who had every structural advantage, and you had only the one leverage point that he couldn't manufacture for himself. She folded her hands on the table. She breathed evenly. She thought about what she needed from this conversation and what she was and wasn't prepared to give for it. He arrived at exactly 7th bell, which told her he'd been early and waited, which told her more than the punctuality itself. He ducked slightly through the low doorway. Not much. He was tall enough that the clearance was marginal, and the slight automatic adjustment to his posture as he entered was one of the more human things she'd seen him do in this re-encounter. He wore the plain traveling clothes still, hood down, and he'd left his escort somewhere outside because he'd agreed to that and apparently intended to hold to it. He closed the door. He looked at the arrangement of the room, the lantern behind her and the shadow it put across his side of the table, and his mouth moved slightly at one corner, not quite a smile. Acknowledgement. He'd noticed what she'd done. He sat down across from her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The lantern threw orange light up across his face and caught the angles of it, the years that had added a different density to the jaw and the lines at the corners of his eyes. And Seris made herself look at him directly, because looking away would be a concession she couldn't afford to give. "Say what you came to say," she told him. "He's mine." "That's not a question." "No, it's not." His eyes were on her, steady and heavy. "You knew. From the beginning, you knew, and you left without telling me." "Yes." "Why?" One word. The way he asked it, not with accusation, not yet, but with the quality of a man who is conducting an inquiry and expects full disclosure because he is accustomed to full disclosure because he is the kind of person who gets what he expects. She recognized the dynamic, and she had decided in the 6 hours she'd spent thinking that she was not going to participate in it. "You know why," she said. "I want to hear you say it." "Then listen carefully because I'll say it once." She kept her voice even, the way she kept everything even when the thing she was managing was anything but. "You handed me a purse. You told me it was better handled cleanly. You dismissed me from your chambers like you were settling an account. I walked out of that palace and discovered I was carrying your child, and I made a decision. I decided that a child of mine was not going to enter the orbit of a man who had demonstrated, precisely and without ambiguity, that love was something he paid to make go away. The silence after that had weight. Vaelor sat with it. He was good at sitting with things. She had always known that. The patience was real, even if it was trained, even if it had been developed as a tactical attribute rather than a natural one. He sat with what she'd said, and he did not defend himself immediately, which surprised her a little. "You didn't give me the information," he said at last. "You made the decision for both of us." "I made the decision for my son." "My son. My son," she said, with a precision that was not aggression, but was not softness either. "I raised him. I fed him through 2 winters when money was short. I was there at every storm, and every fever, and every nightmare. I am the parent in his life. You are a stranger who shares his blood. Those are not equivalent." Something moved in his jaw. "You deliberately kept him from me." "I kept him safe. The result was the same." "That is not—" He stopped, pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose, a gesture she'd never seen from him before, the gesture of a man managing something internal that his usual tools weren't adequate for. "You had no right to make that determination." "I had every right. I was his mother and I was alone and I knew exactly what kind of man I was dealing with." "You knew what kind of man I was in a moment of—" "I knew exactly what kind of man you were in the moment that defined you." She said it without raising her voice. "People show you who they are in the moments that cost them something. You showed me who you were. I believed you." The lantern guttered once, steadied. Vaelor looked at her across the table with an expression that had moved through several territories in the last 2 minutes and was currently residing somewhere between fury and the specific anguish of a man confronted with an accounting of himself that he recognizes as accurate and cannot therefore simply dismiss. This is the thing about guilt that people who wield power rarely have to reckon with directly. It is not neutralized by justification. You can explain every choice you made, provide full context for every circumstance that shaped it, construct a perfectly coherent defense of your conduct, and none of that changes what the conduct did. Vaelor was a man who had operated for 20 years in a world where his decisions were received and then absorbed by the machinery of empire, where consequences were distributed among populations large enough to render individual harm theoretical. He had never had to sit across a table from the specific damage he had caused and have it described to him in a voice this calm. The calm was, she understood, the most damaging part. If she had wept or raged, he would have known how to respond. He had protocols for those. What he had no protocol for was this steady, accurate accounting delivered without theater. "I want to know him," he said. "I know you do. I will not simply—" He stopped again. She could see him editing himself in real time, removing whatever had been in that sentence and choosing differently. "I am not going to walk away from this. That is your right to decide. What you don't get to decide is how it happens. He is the heir to— He is a 4-year-old boy." Her voice sharpened just slightly, the first time it had in this conversation. "He is a 4-year-old boy who has a life here, and people he knows, and a world that makes sense to him. He does not know what he is heir to. He does not know you exist, and you are not going to upend everything he has in the name of your inheritance calculations. I am not—" He made a short, controlled gesture with his hand. "This is not about succession." "Then what is it about?" He looked at her. The lantern light caught the storm in his eyes. Those eyes that she saw every day in the face of her son, that she had never been able to look at without the complicated weight of what they meant. "I looked at him today," Vaelor said, "and I understood something." She waited. "I have built an empire," he said. "I have spent 20 years constructing a thing designed to outlast me, to carry my name forward past my death. I have done it the only way I knew how to do it, which was to remove every element of myself that could be used against me, including the capacity to—" He stopped. His jaw worked once. "Today I looked at a child who has my eyes and my blood, and who I had no knowledge of because I made a decision that I have told myself 100 different stories about in order to live with it. And I understood that in trying to protect the empire from my weakness, I had created a devastation of a different kind. Seris said nothing. She was listening with the careful attention she gave to things that mattered. "I am not asking for your forgiveness," he said. "I am not entitled to that. I am telling you that I understand what I cost both of you, and I am telling you that I intend to be different than the thing that caused it, if you'll allow me proximity to attempt that." The room held the silence, Outside, distantly, the village made its evening sounds. A dog. Voices from the tavern's main room. Wind against the shutters. Seris looked at him for a long time. She was thinking about what she knew of people's capacity for change, which was considerable and also limited, and she was thinking about whether this moment was authentic or whether it was the most sophisticated manipulation she'd ever witnessed. And she was thinking about her son, who had his father's eyes and his father's bearing, and deserved to know where he came from. She was also thinking about what it meant that Vaelor had said he was not asking for forgiveness. In her experience, powerful men always asked for forgiveness. They asked for it as a mechanism, absolution as transaction, a way of closing the account and resuming business. The fact that he hadn't asked for it was either evidence of unusual self-awareness or a more sophisticated play than she'd encountered before. She wasn't sure which. She intended to find out. "You can stay," she said. "In Eld Hollow, not at Maylands. There's a guest house on the South Road. You can stay there as long as you behave like a person and not an emperor. You will not use your rank. You will not use your men. You will not make demands or issue terms or attempt to remove Caelen from this village. You will let me manage the introduction in the way that I determine is appropriate and at the pace I determine is appropriate." His expression shifted through something. "And if I find you making arrangements I'm not aware of," she said, "or sending correspondence that I haven't agreed to, or applying any form of pressure to anyone in this village, you will never see either of us again. I have managed disappearing once. I am very good at it." "I know you are. Do we understand each other?" He held her gaze for a long moment with an expression she couldn't fully read, something layered and old and complicated that was going to take more than one conversation to decode. "Yes," he said. "Good." She pushed back from the table and stood. "Then I'll see you tomorrow. I'll send word about the time." "Seris." She stopped with her hand on the doorframe. "I know I don't have the right to ask," he said, "but I need to know one thing." She waited. "Was he—" His voice dropped to something barely above the ambient sound of the room. "Is he well? Is he—" She turned enough to look at him over her shoulder. He was still sitting at the table, the lantern light across his face, and for just a moment he looked like someone she had once known in a lamplit corridor a long time ago. Not the Emperor, not the apparatus of it, just the man underneath who had looked at her once with something that resembled recognition and hadn't known what to do with it. "He's extraordinary," she said. She walked out. The next morning arrived with the particular clarity that follows hard frost, the air bright and sharp, and carrying the smell of pine resin from the ridge above the village. Seris told Caelen over breakfast that there was going to be someone new to meet. "Who?" said Caelen, without looking up from the serious business of getting every last piece of egg onto his spoon before committing to the journey to his mouth. "Someone who wants to get to know you." "Is it the tall man from the market?" She paused for half a beat. "Yes." Caelen looked up then, considering. He had the face of a child conducting a sincere cost-benefit analysis. "Is he going to ask me a lot of questions?" "Probably." "Will he actually listen to the answers?" The question caught her somewhere between the sternum and the throat. "I think so," she said carefully. "I think he's going to try very hard." Caelen appeared to accept this. He returned to his egg. "Okay," he said, with the magnificent indifference of a child whose world is as yet complete, and who can therefore afford to admit new elements without existential disruption. Seris watched him eat and felt the complicated mixture of things that had become the emotional weather of her life. Love so large and particular it still surprised her, fear living alongside it in close quarters, the specific grief of knowing that what was about to begin could not be unbegun, and underneath all of it, buried deep enough that she barely acknowledged it, something else. Something that felt uncomfortably like the reopening of a door she'd thought she'd sealed. She did not look at that directly. Not yet. She had too many more urgent things to manage. Vaelor arrived exactly when she'd specified. She had arranged for them to meet at the edge of the village, where a low stone wall bordered an open field. Neutral ground, visible from several directions. No enclosed spaces that could feel like traps or corners. He came alone as agreed. He'd changed out of the traveling clothes into something plainer, though plain on him still carried the particular quality of a man who wore even ordinary things, with the unconscious authority of someone who'd never once in his adult life been uncertain about his right to occupy space. Caelen was building something with stones near the wall when they arrived. He looked up at Vaelor. Vaelor looked down at him. This was the moment she had been running from for 4 years. She had built it in her imagination 100 different ways, sometimes as catastrophe, and sometimes as something she couldn't let herself picture too clearly because it hurt in a direction she didn't have a name for. The reality of it was quieter than any of those versions. Just a man and a child in a field, looking at each other. "What are you building?" Vaelor said. Caelen looked at his stones. "A wall, but it keeps falling down because the flat ones are all different sizes." Vaelor crouched down to the boy's level without hesitation. Seris noted that the immediacy of it. No performance, no careful calculation about how to position himself. He just went to where the boy was. "The base has to be wider," he said. "Use the biggest ones on the bottom, even if they're not flat." Caelen considered this architectural advice seriously. "Show me." Something happened in Vaelor's face that she saw from where she stood, and that she was going to be thinking about for a long time afterward. It was not quite emotion in any recognizable form. It was more like the specific expression of a man who has just been handed something he was not prepared for, and whose hands have, without his full authorization, closed around it. He reached for the stones. He showed Caelen the method. Wider base, larger irregular pieces underneath, the physics of it simple and immediate. And Caelen paid the total focused attention he paid to things that genuinely interested him, which was the most demanding kind of attention there was, and they worked together on the small wall for several minutes, while Seris stood back and let it happen, and kept her breathing steady and her face arranged into something that was not what she was actually feeling. Because what she was actually feeling was far more complicated than she had the budget for right now. She was feeling the specific terror of watching something begin, not the introduction. That was already happening, and she had made her peace with its necessity. What she was feeling was something older and less rational. She was watching Vaelor Drax crouch in a field in Eld Hollow, with his elbows on his knees and his dark head bent close to her son's, as they assessed the structural integrity of a small stone wall, and something in the picture was so exactly and so painfully what it should have been, what it could have been, in another version of events, in the version where he had been different in the moment that he hadn't been, that it arrived in her chest like a physical impact. She had armored herself against him. She had built that armor carefully and maintained it well over 4 years, and she had believed it to be complete. She was now discovering that armor built in his absence had not been tested against his presence. That was when she heard the hooves. 3 horses coming fast up the south road. Too fast. The wrong kind of speed. The speed that carries information before it arrives. Vaelor heard it too. He was already standing and turned, and Seris watched his posture change in the space of 2 seconds from the man crouching in a field into something else entirely. His shoulders set. His chin came up. His eyes went to the road with the flat, assessing focus of someone who had spent 20 years receiving bad news from a distance and learning to read its shape before it arrived. The lead rider was one of his escort, the big man with the flattened nose, pushing his horse harder than the road deserved. He pulled up 15 feet away and dropped from the saddle before the horse had fully stopped and covered the remaining distance in a walk that managed to be both fast and controlled in the way of a man delivering something urgent to someone who does not appreciate theater. "Your Majesty." His voice was very low. He glanced once at Seris and once at Caelen, and then his eyes went back to Vaelor. "Word from the capital." Vaelor walked 2 steps away, putting distance between the conversation and where Caelen stood with his stones. Seris stayed where she was. The messenger leaned in and spoke against Vaelor's ear. She watched Vaelor's face. She had thought, in the market yesterday, that she had seen the most dangerous version of him. The version without leverage, wanting something he couldn't simply take. She understood now, watching what happened to his expression over the next 30 seconds, that she had been wrong about which version was the most dangerous. The most dangerous version was this one. The one where something had happened that had just changed every calculation he'd been making since yesterday. He turned back towards her. His face was composed. Completely composed. Whatever the message was had been absorbed and sealed behind the composure with a speed that was almost frightening to observe. "I need to speak with you," he said. "Privately." "What happened?" "Privately," he repeated, and the way he said it was the first time since this began that she heard the Emperor in it clearly, and without any of the other registers he'd been operating in since yesterday. Caelen was watching them both with those eyes. "Caelen," Seris kept her voice easy. "Go back to the inn and tell Malin I said you can have the rest of the sweet rolls from breakfast." He lit up with the pure, uncomplicated joy of a child granted unexpected dessert and was gone at a run before she'd finished the sentence. She looked at Vaelor. "Tell me." He looked at her for a moment with something moving behind the composure. Not fear, not quite, but the nearest neighbor to fear that a man like Vaelor would allow himself to house. "There has been a development in the capital," he said, "regarding the succession." "What kind of development?" "The kind," he said, "that means my council now knows I have been absent from Nareth for 4 days without explanation, that there are 2 noble factions actively proposing alternate heirs, and that someone in my court has sent a sealed inquiry to the Eld Hollow Regional Registry asking whether any child of unrecorded parentage has been registered in this province in the last 5 years. The cold air between them suddenly had a different quality. "Someone already knows," she said. "Someone suspects. That's not better." "No," he agreed, "it is not." She looked at him across the short distance of the field with the mountains above, and the smell of frost in the air, and her son running back toward the village with his inheritance tucked in those storm-gray eyes he didn't yet understand were the most dangerous things about him. "How long?" she said. "Days. A week at most before they trace this." She looked at the road. She looked at the village. She thought about 4 years of careful, deliberate, load-bearing silence, and what it had cost her to build it, and what it would cost both of them when it fell. "If they find him before we control how this information moves," Vaelor said, "the people looking for a reason to challenge my authority will use him as that reason. He becomes a weapon in someone else's hands." His voice was flat and direct, the voice of a man describing a tactical reality rather than a human crisis. But she heard something underneath it. "I will not allow that." "You don't get to allow or not allow." "Seris." He said her name with a weight that stopped her. "I am not talking about my authority. I'm talking about his safety." She looked at him. The mountain wind moved through the dry grass around the wall where her son had been building things 10 minutes ago. She thought about what she knew of what happened to illegitimate heirs when political factions decided they were useful. She thought about what she knew of what happened to them when those same factions decided they were inconvenient. She thought about a small boy who didn't know what he was and was currently running toward sweet rolls without the faintest idea that several people who had never met him had already begun deciding what to do with his life. "What are you saying?" she said. "I am saying," Vaelor said, with the precision of a man who has made a decision and is now issuing it to the world whether the world is ready to receive it or not, that we are out of time for gradual. I am saying that the only thing that protects him now is acknowledgement. Public, formal, irrevocable acknowledgement. She stared at him. "I am saying," he said, "that I need to take you both back to Nareth." The field held them in its silence. The frost on the grass was beginning to catch the morning light and throw it back in small, cold points of brightness. Seris Vale stood very still and understood that the 4 years she had spent building a life designed to keep this moment from arriving had just run out. There was no more road behind her, there was only what came next. And what came next was going to break something. The only question left was whether it was going to be her, or the Empire, or the man standing in front of her still learning, after everything, how to ask instead of take. She looked at the road south. She looked at the village. She looked at Vaelor Drax standing in a frost-hard field in Eld Hollow, looking back at her with an expression that contained more than she had the time to read. She said, "I need until morning." He nodded once. She turned and walked back toward the inn, and she did not run and she did not look back, and every step she took was the last step of the life she had built, and the first step of whatever was coming next. And the cold mountain air filled her lungs sharp and clear and absolute. And somewhere ahead of her, her son was eating sweet rolls without knowing that before tomorrow ended, his world was going to become something neither of them could yet imagine. She didn't sleep. Seris lay on the narrow bed in her room at Malin's inn with Caelen curled against her side, his breathing deep and even and completely trusting, and she stared at the ceiling and ran the variables until her mind had worn grooves in every path and they all led to the same place. The morning was coming whether she was ready for it or not. The choice Vaelor had laid in front of her was not really a choice. It was the shape that inevitability had decided to wear tonight so she could feel like she'd participated in it. She understood this. She accepted it the way she accepted most hard things, by looking at it directly until the looking became bearable. What she could not make bearable was the thing underneath it. The fear was not for herself. She had made peace with what her own circumstances cost a long time ago, in the specific way that people make peace with costs they cannot avoid paying. The fear was for the small person breathing against her ribs. Caelen had been built in Eld Hollow, shaped by mountain winters and Malin's kitchen and the uncomplicated freedoms of a life where the most dangerous thing he'd encountered was the fence he'd climbed last spring that had deposited him face first into the mud on the other side. He was 4 years old, and his world was complete and comprehensible and safe. What Nareth would do to that, she could not fully calculate, but she had spent 2 years inside the court of Nareth, and she knew enough to understand that it would begin immediately, and it would be thorough. Courts reshapen the people inside them. That was not accidental. It was the mechanism by which power perpetuated itself, by converting whatever entered it into something that served its logic, stripping away whatever couldn't survive the conversion. She thought about Vaelor. She thought about what he'd said in the back room of Mare's tavern. The price of the crown is mutilation. He'd said it with the flat, factual tone of someone describing a procedure they'd undergone rather than a wound they still carried, and that tone had told her more than the words had. He was not performing insight. He had arrived at that understanding the way people arrive at things they've spent years refusing to approach. Suddenly and completely, and too late to change anything it had already cost. She pressed her palm flat against Caelen's back and felt him breathe. She thought, if I do this, I cannot undo it. She thought, if I don't do this, someone else will do it without my consent, and without any of the conditions I've established. She thought, there is no version of tomorrow where Caelen remains only mine. Around the 4th hour before dawn, she stopped trying to find a different answer and started working on how to survive the one she had. She made a short list of what she would require from Vaelor before she agreed to anything formally. Conditions, not requests. The distinction mattered, and she intended to make it clear. Caelen would not be separated from her under any circumstances. She would have an established role that was not dependent on Vaelor's continued goodwill. Something structural, something that couldn't be revoked by mood or political pressure. Any formal acknowledgement would name her clearly, not as some abstracted consort buried in the administrative language of court decrees, but with the specific, unmistakable language of legitimate standing. And Caelen would be told the truth, all of it, at the time and in the manner that she determined, not when it was politically convenient for someone else. These were not negotiable. She repeated that to herself until it settled into her bones. Dawn came gray and cold over the eastern ridge. She got up without waking Caelen, dressed in the dark, and went downstairs. Malin was already at the stove, because Malin was always already at the stove, operating under the apparently sincere belief that mornings began before other people had the information about this. She looked up when Seris came in and said nothing, which was the particular language of a woman who had seen enough people arrive at important mornings to know that some of them required coffee before they required conversation. She put a cup on the table. Seris sat down and wrapped both hands around it. "I'm going to need to ask you something," Seris said. "Then ask. If I'm not back by midday, will you keep Caelen until I send word?" Malin looked at her over the rim of her own cup. The assessment in her eyes was clear and direct and had no judgment in it, which was the quality Seris had valued most in her from the beginning. "Of course," she said. "You know that." "I know. I wanted to say it out loud anyway." "All right." Malin set her cup down. "You want me to tell you it's going to be fine?" "No." Seris shook her head. "I want you to tell me you'll take care of him if it isn't." Malin held her gaze for a long moment. Something moved through her face that was old and deep and had its own history in it. "Yes," she said. "I will take care of him." Seris nodded. She finished the coffee. She stood up and pulled her coat from the hook by the door, and she went out into the cold gray morning before she could locate any new arguments against it. She found Vaelor at the guest house on the south road before full light had established itself over the valley. He answered the door himself, which meant he'd either dismissed his escort for the night or he'd been awake and waiting. By the state of him, no evidence of sleep, The same controlled density of attention he'd carried yesterday compressed tighter now, the way pressure increases when the container holding it gets smaller. She concluded it was the latter. He stepped back to let her in without a word. The guesthouse's front room was functional and cold, a fire recently built and not yet fully caught. He'd been working at the table, so papers, she could see, though he turned them face down as she entered, which she noted and tucked away. "I have conditions," she said, before he could set the frame for this conversation. "I expected you would." "They're not negotiable." "Tell me what they are." She told him, clearly, without flourish, in the order she'd arranged them. Caelen stays with her. She gets structural standing, not dependent on goodwill. The formal acknowledgement uses plain language, and the truth belongs to her to deliver on her terms and timeline. He listened the way he'd always listened to her, she realized, with a completeness that was different from the partial, parallel processing listening of someone waiting for their turn to speak. He actually took it in. She had valued that once. She still valued it. That was a piece of information about herself that she did not examine closely right now. When she finished, he said yes. She waited for the qualifications. None came. "All of it?" she said. "All of it." He held her gaze steadily. "I am not going to negotiate your son's safety or your dignity. Those are not bargaining positions." She studied him for any evidence of the angle she wasn't seeing yet. She found none, which either meant he had changed in the ways he'd claimed or that he had gotten very much better at the performance of it. She filed the uncertainty and moved forward because the morning was not going to hold itself in suspension while she resolved it. "Then we need to talk about the timeline," she said. They talked for an hour. Practical things. How the return to Nareth would be structured. Who in his court would need to be managed before the information became public. What the announcement would say and who would draft it. How Caelen would be introduced into the palace environment without being thrown into the deep end of court life before he had any of the equipment for it. Vaelor knew his court in the way only someone who had built and operated it for 2 decades could know it. He understood which factions would move against this and how, which ones could be neutralized before they had time to organize, which individuals would need to be brought to understanding privately before the public announcement made discussion moot. It was, she recognized with a complicated feeling, the kind of strategic thinking she had always known he was capable of, clear, thorough, oriented toward protecting something rather than dominating it. She had wondered in the years of his absence whether there was any version of him capable of directing that intelligence toward protection rather than control. She was watching what might be evidence of it. She reserved judgment. They had reached the question of timing, whether to leave within 2 days or give her a week to prepare Caelen, when the knock at the guesthouse door produced a tension in Vaelor's posture that she registered before she consciously processed why. Not the knock itself, the pattern of it. 3 beats. Pause. 2. He was already standing when the door opened. The man who entered was not one of the escorts she'd seen yesterday. He was older, dressed in the plain clothing of a traveling merchant, but wearing it in the way that clothes wear a person rather than the reverse, as if the garment were a costume, and underneath it was something else entirely. Gray at the temples. Eyes that moved through the room in the fast, cataloging sweep of someone whose profession required constant threat assessment. Seris knew the type. She had seen enough of them in the palace. Men who moved in the spaces between official presence and unofficial action, who had no formal titles and no recorded functions, and whose work showed up only in the results it produced. Vaelor's intelligence corps. "Marin," Vaelor said. The man's name was not, Seris was confident, Marin, but the fiction of it wasn't for her benefit. "There's a problem," the man said. He glanced at Seris. "Speak plainly," Vaelor said. "The inquiry to the provincial registry." The man's voice was flat and economical, each word carrying its specific weight and nothing additional. "It wasn't sent by the council. We've traced it." "To who?" A pause that lasted precisely long enough to communicate that what followed was going to require handling. "Lord Cassian Herath." Something changed in the air of the room. Seris didn't know the name. She watched Vaelor's face, and she read what she found there the way she had learned to read his face. Not by the expressions he allowed, but by the quality of control he deployed over the ones he didn't. What she saw was not surprise. What she saw was the specific, terrible expression of a man confronted with the confirmation of something he had been refusing to fully believe. "How long has he known?" Vaelor said. "Unknown, but the inquiry was submitted 9 days ago." The man called Merrin delivered this fact with the flat precision of a professional delivering information he understands is going to cause significant damage. "Before you left the capital, the room received that 9 days ago." Vaelor had been in Eld Hollow for 4 days. The inquiry had been submitted before his departure, which meant that whoever Lord Cassian Herath was, he had known or suspected before the Emperor had known, and had made a move before the Emperor had made one. "Who is Cassian Herath?" Seris said. Vaelor did not answer immediately, which was an answer. He moved to the table and stood with his back to her for a moment, which was another answer. The man called Merrin looked at the middle distance with the professional discretion of someone who had learned to become momentarily invisible when the people in the room needed to believe they were alone. "He is my chancellor," Vaelor said at last. "He has served in that office for 11 years. Seris understood the geometry of this immediately. 11 years, the closest administrative proximity to the Emperor possible outside the bloodline itself. Access to every communication, every intelligence report, every piece of information that moved through the machinery of the Empire. The kind of institutional knowledge that made a chancellor as powerful as many kings, and the kind of proximity that could, if the intelligence were there, build models of the Emperor's behavior accurate enough to predict decisions before they were made." She thought about the corridor where she and Vaelor had first really spoken, the library, the months of careful, quiet accumulation of whatever they had accumulated. A chancellor who paid attention would have noticed. A chancellor who paid attention and had his own agenda would have filed it. "He's been building towards something," she said. "Yes." Vaelor's voice had taken on a different quality, not anger, something older and colder than anger. The sound of a man who has had a long time to develop complicated feelings about something and has just received the information that simplifies them. "I have known he was building towards something for approximately 18 months. I did not know what it was. Now you do. Now I do." The man called Merrin cleared his throat minimally. "There is more." Vaelor turned. The inquiry carried a secondary purpose. Merrin removed a folded document from inside his coat. He placed it on the table without opening it. It was designed to confirm a location, not merely to establish existence. Lord Herath now knows where the child is. The silence was absolute. Seris processed this the way she processed emergencies, fast, without the luxury of the feelings that wanted to come with it, moving immediately to the practical. "Does he know who I am? He knows you were a palace attendant who left service 4 years ago. He has likely calculated the timing." Merrin's eyes moved to her with the impersonal assessment of someone reading a situation rather than judging a person. "He is not a man who lacks capacity for calculation." "What does he want?" she said. The question was directed at Vaelor. Vaelor was looking at the unopened document on the table with an expression that had moved fully into the territory of something she hadn't seen on him before. The particular cold fury of a man who has just understood the full dimensions of a long-running deception executed by someone he'd trusted with the mechanics of everything he'd built. This is the nature of betrayal by proximity. It is not the act itself that constitutes the deepest wound. It is the retrospective reconstruction. Every conversation, every decision, every moment of apparent loyalty now retroactively illuminated by what has been revealed. The understanding that what you were receiving was a performance sustained over years by someone skilled enough to sustain it. The Emperor of Nareth had spent 20 years trusting his own intelligence, his own capacity to read people, his own ability to identify threats before they became mortal. Cassian Herath had been inside that intelligence infrastructure for 11 of those years, close enough to the Emperor's judgment to help shape the information on which it was based. Vaelor had been managed, carefully, by someone he'd employed to help him manage others. "He wants the throne," Vaelor said. "He doesn't want the title. He wants the functional reality of it. He has been positioning himself for an incapacitation scenario, either my death or a succession crisis severe enough to require a regent." His jaw worked once. Caelen is the crisis he's manufacturing. An unacknowledged heir presents a choice point. He can be used to legitimize a challenge or eliminated to clear the field. Either serves Herath's purpose, depending on which coalition he's assembled, The word eliminated entered the room like cold coming under a door. Seris heard it and felt something happen in her chest that was below thought, a physical animal response, a mother's nervous system reacting to a threat before the rational mind had finished processing the information. Her hands were still. Her face was still. Inside those stilled surfaces, something had ignited. "How far ahead of us is he?" she said. Her voice came out very flat, which was what happened when she was using all available resources for something other than tone. Meryn looked at Vaelor. Vaelor looked at Seris. "If his inquiry has already been answered," Vaelor said, "and it has, then he knows Caelen's location. He has had that information for at minimum 48 hours. If he moved on it immediately," he stopped. Seris was already moving. She was across the room and through the door before either man fully understood what she was doing, and she was running, not the controlled, purposeful walking she'd deployed every time she'd needed to cross a distance without appearing to run, but actually running, the flat-out sprint of someone whose calculations have just produced an answer too urgent for composure to survive. The south road to Maelin's Inn was a quarter mile, and she covered it with the kind of focus that narrowed the entire world to the next 20 meters. The frost-hard ground was uneven, and the morning light was still thin, and at one point she stumbled on a rut and caught herself without breaking stride, and somewhere behind her she could hear footsteps. Vaelor, his longer legs closing the gap. But she didn't look back. She didn't slow. She kept her eyes on the inn's chimney smoke visible above the roofline. She came through Maelin's front door so hard it rebounded from the wall. The common room was empty. "Maelin!" Her voice came out sharp and high, and not at all the voice she'd been using for the last 12 hours. "Nothing." "Maelin." She was through the common room and at the kitchen doorway when she heard it. Caelen's voice from upstairs, raised in the specific pitch of a child who is frightened, and another voice she didn't recognize, low and male and deliberate. She took the stairs 3 at a time. The door to Caelen's room was open. Maelin was in the doorway, braced against the frame with both hands, her body physically blocking entry in the way of a woman who had decided she was going to be an obstacle and was prepared to remain one until something more forceful than a stranger's authority moved her. Blood on her lip, recent. Her eyes found Seris with an expression of such focused relief that it hit like a blow. 2 men. Seris catalogued them in the 2 seconds it took to reach the doorway. Professional, like the man called Meryn, but not intelligence core. These were something more direct, their function physical and immediate. One had Caelen, not roughly, not yet, but with the secured grip of a man who knew how to hold a small person and prevent them from being elsewhere. Caelen was rigid with the particular frozen still terror of a child who understood that something was very wrong and had decided that movement would make it worse. His eyes found hers. In them she saw 2 things simultaneously: fear, and the absolute bedrock certainty that now that she was there, the fear's timeline was limited. She had put that certainty there. 4 years of it, every storm and nightmare and moment of uncertainty, she had been the answer, the thing that ended the fear. She stood in the doorway and she thought, these are not the same as the ones at the market. These arrived overnight, which means the order was given before Vaelor even arrived in Eld Hollow, possibly before he left the capital, which meant something she wasn't ready to look at directly, but looked at anyway because she was not a woman who chose comfortable blindness over accurate sight. "Let him go," she said. The man holding Caelen looked at her with the flat assessment of a professional calibrating an obstacle. "We're conducting an inquiry on behalf of—" "I said let him go." Vaelor came through the door behind her. The effect was immediate. Both men shifted, not cowering, these weren't men who cowered, but the recalibration of professionals who have just revised their threat assessment substantially upward. The man holding Caelen maintained his grip, but his eyes went to Vaelor with the specific look of a man consulting a hierarchy he hadn't expected to appear. "Your Majesty." The second man, the one not holding a 4-year-old, recovered faster. "We were acting on— release the child." Vaelor's voice in this mode had a quality that was different from everything else she'd heard from him in the last 2 days. It was not loud. It did not need to be. It was the voice of a man who had been issuing commands in this register for 20 years and whose body had integrated the assumption of compliance so completely that anything less than immediate response simply registered as a malfunction to be corrected. Now, Caelen was released. He crossed the room to Seris at a speed that made it clear he'd been calculating the distance since she appeared in the doorway, and she caught him, and he pressed his face against her neck, and she held the back of his head with both hands and breathed. She felt him shaking, small, fast, the vibration of a child's nervous system coming down from high alarm. "Hey," she said, very quietly, against his hair. "I've got you. I've got you." He said nothing, just held on. She looked up at the two men over his head. She looked at their faces and she filed everything about them, their builds, their features, the specific cut of their plain clothes, and the quality of their boots, which were too good for what they were pretending to be. She filed all of it with the cold, thorough completeness of a woman storing information she intends to use. Vaelor was talking to them in a voice pitched too low for her to catch the words. She didn't need the words. She could read the result. Both men were actively consolidating themselves into a smaller version of what they'd been when she'd entered the room. The physical vocabulary of men being informed that whatever authorization they'd been operating under had just been superseded. Caelen had stepped away from the doorframe and was pressing the back of her hand against her lip, with the practical, irritated air of someone who considered getting punched in the face a significant inconvenience and was already thinking about what came next. "Are you all right?" Seris said to her. "I've had worse. Told them they weren't coming in. They disagreed." She looked at the two men with an expression of comprehensive disdain. "Woke the boy up doing it. He was frightened." "I know." Seris looked at Vaelor. He was looking back at her with an expression that had moved past the cold operational fury she'd seen at the guest house into something rawer and less managed. He understood what she was reading in this room. He understood that whatever he'd said to her about changed intentions had just been tested against evidence that had nothing to do with his intentions and everything to do with the machinery he was embedded in. Herath had moved before Vaelor arrived here, which meant these men had been en route to Eld Hollow before Vaelor had even found her in the market, which meant the timing of Vaelor's own appearance in this valley now required examination. She looked at his face, and she hated that she was running this calculation, and she ran it anyway because this was what survival cost. The refusal to stop being accurate, even when accuracy hurt. "Did you know they were coming?" she said. The room was completely still. Caelen had gone quiet against her shoulder. Vaelor held her gaze, and she watched him understand precisely what she was asking and what it meant that she was asking it, and what it would mean if the answer were yes, and what it would mean if it were no, and neither of them had the luxury of pretending the question wasn't sitting in the air between them like a blade. "No," he said. She looked at him for a long time. She thought about the papers he'd turned face down on the table when she arrived. She thought about the man called Marin and his precise, economical delivery of information. She thought about 9 days. The inquiry submitted before Vaelor left Nareth, the timeline that meant Herath had moved early, the timeline that also meant Vaelor had potentially received intelligence about Seris's location before he'd ever ridden into Eld Hollow. She thought about the marketplace, his escort, the way a man who'd been in Eld Hollow by accident might look, versus the way a man who'd come here with a destination might look. She thought about what it meant that she was not sure. She thought about the 4 years she had spent being sure of her own judgment, and the fact that the last time she'd been certain about a man's honesty, she'd been handed a purse in exchange for her silence. The not sure was, she understood, the most dangerous territory she had ever stood in, because she was about to be asked to take her son into the center of an empire on the basis of a man's word, and she could not establish with certainty whether that word was built on truth or on an architecture of managed information she hadn't yet found the edges of. And she had until morning had started to make this decision. And morning was already here. Caelen looked at Seris with the eyes of a woman who had lived 60 years and pulled a great deal of surviving out of small, bad circumstances, and she said very quietly, "Seris." Seris looked at her. "Sometimes the only way to know if the ground holds," Caelen said, "is to put your weight on it." The room held that for a moment. Outside, the mountain wind was moving along the ridge, and the frost was beginning to give up its hold on the morning grass. And somewhere distant, a horse was being saddled, and Eld Hollow was waking up in its ordinary way, indifferent as always to what was happening inside any particular room of any particular building within its borders. Seris looked at Vaelor Drax, Emperor of Nareth, father of the child pressing his face against her neck. She thought about everything she knew of him and everything she didn't, and the space between those two things and what it cost to live in that space. She thought about the two men who had put their hands on her son in a place she had built specifically to keep his hands safe. She thought about what it meant to protect a child from the world versus what it meant to equip him to survive it. "I need your word," she said. Not as the Emperor, as his father. Vaelor took one step toward her, then stopped, because she hadn't invited the step, and he understood, finally, in the way some people only understand things when they have no alternative, that the distance between them was hers to manage. "You have it," he said. She looked at him for a long moment more. Then she looked down at Caelen, who had lifted his face from her shoulder and was watching Vaelor with those storm-gray eyes, and the boy's expression was not the terror of 5 minutes ago. It was the focused, assessing calm of a child who had decided to reserve judgment. He had her instincts. She thought, that might be enough. That might be what it takes. She thought, this is going to be the hardest thing I have ever done. She thought, I have been doing the hardest thing available to me for 4 years and I am still standing. She looked back at Vaelor. "We leave at dawn tomorrow," she said. "I have conditions about how Caelen is introduced to the capital. I have conditions about where I stand in any formal announcement, and I have one more condition that is not negotiable." She said the last words with a precision that came from somewhere beneath composure, from the place where everything she'd built in 4 years of silence and survival and fierce, devoted motherhood had its foundation. "Whoever sent these men into this room answers for it, formally, in front of witnesses. Before I set foot in Nareth." Vaelor looked at her. His jaw was set and his eyes were steady, and he looked like a man standing at the threshold of something that was going to require him to become different than the thing he'd spent 20 years building. "Yes," he said, and the shape of tomorrow shifted into something none of them could yet fully see. An empire balanced on the edge of a reckoning, a woman who had survived abandonment about to walk back into the house of the man who'd caused it, and a child between them who knew nothing of crowns except that the tall man had shown him how to stack stones so the wall wouldn't fall, and had listened when he'd talked, and had come through the door when the fear was its worst. Which was, Seris thought, perhaps the only qualification that had ever actually mattered. She stood up. She took her son's hand, and she began to prepare for a war she had never wanted to fight, in a country she had fled, beside a man she was still deciding whether to trust. Because the alternative was to let the war come to Eld Hollow again, and next time there would be more than 2 men at the door, and the door might not hold. The ground was shifting under everything she'd built. The only question left was whether she was going to fall with it, or learn, right now, in the cold morning light of a mountain village that had sheltered her and her boy, and asked nothing in return, to walk on ground that moved. They rode out of Eld Hollow before full light. Seris had packed in 40 minutes. Everything that mattered fit into 2 bags, which was the specific freedom of a person who had spent 4 years deliberately not accumulating things that couldn't be carried. Caelen wore his heaviest coat and his good boots and held the small carved horse that Malin had given him 2 winters ago with the focused grip of a child who understood, on some level below words, that the world was shifting and that certain things needed to be held on to. Malin stood in the inn's doorway and watched them go. She did not wave. She was not that kind of woman. She simply stood and watched, and Seris looked back once, just once, which was already more than she usually allowed herself, and found in Malin's face the particular expression of a person watching someone they love walk toward something difficult, and having the wisdom to know that the most useful thing they can offer at that moment is permission to go. Seris turned back to the road. The mountains fell away behind them over the course of the first day's riding, and the terrain flattened into the wide, cold plains of the central province, and the road north toward Nareth opened up in front of them gray and frost-hard and absolute. Vaelor rode alongside her without pushing conversation, which she appreciated. He had organized the escort into a configuration that kept Caelen's position at the center of it. Not caged, nothing that would feel like captivity to a small boy already navigating an overloaded amount of new information, but shielded, the riders positioned with a professional subtlety that Caelen would read as company rather than protection, and that was, in fact, the most serious personal security arrangement Seris had ever been proximate to. She noted it, filed it in the column that was building beside his name. On the second day, when Caelen had fallen asleep against her in the saddle, in the way of small children who have decided that the body's needs outrank whatever is happening around them, Vaelor brought his horse close and spoke quietly. I sent word ahead last night. She looked at him. Herath will know I'm returning. He will know I have you and Caelen with me. He will have had 4 days to consolidate whatever coalition he's assembled. He said it with the flat precision of a man laying out a tactical situation, but she heard underneath it something that was not precision. It was the sound of a man preparing himself for what he knew was coming. I want you to understand what we are riding toward. I've been thinking about nothing else for 2 days, she said. Then you understand it may not be clean. I understand it will be whatever it's going to be, and that I need to be ready for the version of it I can't predict. She shifted Caelen's weight against her and looked at the road ahead. Tell me about Herath. Tell me everything, not the version you'd give a council, the real version. Vaelor was quiet for a moment. Then he began to talk, and she listened with everything she had. Cassian Herath had come to his chancellorship through the specific route that the most dangerous men always travel. Genuine competence deployed in service of genuine ambition, camouflaged well enough for long enough that the competence was trusted, and the ambition was invisible until it wasn't. He was not a man who had always planned betrayal. He was a man who had served faithfully for years while the Empire's structures taught him, slowly and thoroughly, that the machinery of power was value neutral. It served whoever controlled it, and the question of who should control it was just another competition, no different in nature from any other the court conducted. He had watched Vaelor make decisions for 11 years. He had shaped the information flow that informed those decisions. He had, gradually and systematically, become the person inside the court who understood most completely how the Emperor thought, what his tolerances were, where his attention focused and where it didn't, and where the specific vulnerabilities were that a man like Vaelor, trained to see vulnerabilities in others, trained to believe himself without them, would be slowest to recognize in himself. Vaelor said all of this without apparent emotion, but with the quality of a man who has spent the long days of a difficult ride looking at something he'd been refusing to examine and is now committed to finishing the examination regardless of what it costs him. He understood that I had no direct heir, Vaelor said. He understood that without one, the succession question was the pressure point that would eventually destabilize everything. He has been building toward a regency arrangement, a crisis in which he steps in as the stabilizing force because he is the most trusted person in the administrative structure. And now you have an heir, which eliminates this crisis he's been cultivating, or redirects it. His voice was level. If he can delegitimize the heir before the acknowledgement is formalized, the succession question reopens. If he can delegitimize you, the acknowledgement carries less weight in the court of public opinion. And if the heir disappears, the word sat between them. Vaelor's jaw set. He will not touch Caelen. You couldn't prevent the 2 men in Malin's inn. Those were advanced scouts. They were not authorized to... He stopped. The restraint in his voice was absolute, which meant what was underneath it was not restrained at all. That will not happen again. She looked at him. You sound certain. I am certain, because I am ending Herath's access to the apparatus today, before we reach the capital walls. He looked forward. I should have moved on him 18 months ago when I first suspected. I told myself I needed more evidence. I told myself I was managing it. The corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile. The specific expression of a man acknowledging his own miscalculation without the escape of self-pity. I was protecting the institution from the disruption of the process. I forgot that institutions don't protect themselves. People inside them do. There was philosophy in that, the hard-earned kind, bought at significant cost. Power structures create the illusion of permanence. They look so solid, so self-sustaining, so much larger than any individual within them, that the people who operate them begin to confuse the structure's resilience with their own. They begin to believe that the institution will absorb individual failures because it has always absorbed them before. They stop treating their own accountability as urgent because the machine continues running regardless. This is how trusted people become dangerous ones, not through sudden malice, but through the gradual permission that authority grants itself to defer the uncomfortable reckoning. Vaelor had deferred. Now the deferral was presenting its full invoice. Nareth appeared on the 3rd morning as a darkness on the horizon that resolved slowly, over hours of riding, into towers and walls, and the specific weight of a place that had been the center of something enormous for a very long time. Seris had not seen it in 4 years, and she had not missed it, and looking at it now, she felt the complicated mixture of things that places from your past produce. Not nostalgia. She had no nostalgia for what Nareth had cost her, but a kind of recognition that was also a bracing. This place had shaped her circumstances for years. She was returning to it changed in ways it hadn't authorized, and she intended to remain changed. Caelen pressed close against her and looked at the city with enormous eyes. "That's very big," he said. "Yes." "Do people live in there?" "Many thousands of people." He considered this with the gravity it deserved. "Is our house in there?" She looked at the towers. She looked at the black spires of the palace rising above the city's roofline into the cold sky. "That's what we're going to find out," she said. The gates of Nareth opened ahead of the imperial standard without ceremony, the mechanism of a city that had learned long ago to prepare for an emperor's return. But something was different today, and she felt it immediately. The guards on the inner gate were doubled. The streets along the approach route were too empty for midday. The faces she could see in the windows of the buildings flanking the road had a quality of watching that wasn't the ordinary curiosity of citizens observing a procession. The city knew something was happening. Vaelor had felt it too. He rode with the contained, forward-oriented attention of a man receiving environmental information through his skin. He said nothing. He kept riding. They were 3 blocks inside the inner wall when the first group appeared. 40 men, maybe more, blocking the road ahead in a configuration that was too organized for coincidence and too deliberate for misunderstanding. Full armor. Armed. The crest on their shields was Nareth's eagle, which made it worse. These weren't foreign soldiers, weren't mercenaries, were men who wore the Empire's own mark and had been positioned here to impede the Emperor's return. Vaelor halted the escort with one raised hand. The street was completely quiet. Seris had her arm around Caelen, and she kept her breathing level, and she assessed the geometry of the situation in the way she'd been doing since the inn in Eld Hollow. Exits, angles, where the bodies were, and where the gaps between them were. A man walked forward from the blocked formation. 50 or so, moving with the unhurried confidence of someone who had decided in advance that this confrontation would end in his favor. Not in armor himself. He wore the formal dark coat of court administration, the kind of clothing that spoke of offices and authorities and the power that runs through paper rather than iron. His face was composed, intelligent. The face of a man who had been managing complex situations for a long time and found this one, despite everything, manageable. Chancellor Cassian Herath stopped 20 feet away and looked at Vaelor Drax with the expression of a man who has rehearsed this moment and found his own performance adequate. "Your Majesty." His voice was even, courteous. The courtesy of a man who is so thoroughly committed to a position that politeness has become available again, the way people become calm when the hardest decision is already made. "The Council was concerned by your unannounced absence. We are relieved to see you returned safely." Vaelor looked at him for a moment. There is a specific quality to the silence of a man who has decided. Not the silence of someone considering options. That silence has texture, movement, the sense of interior machinery running. What Vaelor's silence had was the quality of something that has stopped moving because it has arrived. He had been moving toward this for 18 months, maybe longer, circling it with the careful orbit of a man who understood what confronting it would cost. He was done circling. "Cassian," Vaelor said. Herath waited. "Step aside." A pause. Brief. The pause of a man revising from the script he'd prepared to something more direct. "I'm afraid the Council has some concerns that require step aside." The same register. No louder. But the second delivery had something in it that the first hadn't. The quality of a door closing rather than opening, the sound of a man who has offered the courteous version and is prepared to provide the alternative without further discussion. Herath looked at him. Then his eyes moved to Seris. They stayed there for a moment with the evaluating, impersonal quality of someone assessing the weight of a complication. Then they moved to Caelen. Whatever he saw in the boy's face, those eyes, the bearing, the specific genetic inheritance that operated with the subtlety of a hammer, moved something in his own face. Not shock. He had already known. But confirmation has its own impact even when you've prepared for it. The moment when the abstract becomes concrete and the plans you've built around a theoretical circumstance encounter the actual living reality of it. He looked back at Vaelor. The council cannot in good conscience allow an unverified heir to enter the palace until questions of Vaelor moved his horse forward. Not fast, not dramatically. Just a steady, purposeful advance that covered the 20 feet between them in the time it took Herath to understand that the Emperor was not going to stop. The Chancellor took one step back, then caught himself, then held ground, because backing down from an Emperor in front of 40 armed men was a certain kind of statement, and he understood statements. Vaelor halted the horse 2 feet away and looked down at the man who had spent 11 years sitting close enough to touch everything he'd built. "You sent men to put hands on my son," Vaelor said. Very quiet. The quietness that lives at the far side of rage past the noise of it, where what remains is cold and exact. "You sent them 4 days ago, before I even knew he existed. You were already moving against a child whose existence you had merely inferred." He paused to let that sit. "Tell me, Cassian, in 11 years have I ever given you reason to believe that I would not respond to that?" Herath's composure was intact. Seris gave him that. The man had genuine nerve, the kind that either came from extraordinary training or from the conviction that he was operating from a position of structural strength that could survive this confrontation. "What I did was in service of the Empire's stability. An unacknowledged heir in the hands of an unknown woman in a provincial village represents in service of the Empire." Vaelor repeated it. Not a question, not mockery, something flatter than both. "You'll use that phrase. You'll use it until the last moment, because it is the only frame in which what you've done is defensible, and you have been living inside that frame for so long, you've forgotten it's a frame." He turned to the nearest rider in his escort, a young captain whose name Seris didn't know, but whose face had the focused, committed expression of a man who had picked a side before this morning and was prepared to hold to it. "Captain Dale, Lord Herath is relieved of his chancellorship. He is to be taken to the East Tower under guard. His seals are forfeit immediately." Vaelor turned back to Herath. "If you give the men behind you the order you're considering, you will have started a civil engagement inside the capital's walls, and whatever your actual priorities are, that outcome serves none of them." A pause. "Or you can walk with Captain Dale, and we can conduct the accounting of your 11 years through the processes you spent that time maintaining. Your choice. Make it now." "Ursigi." The street was absolutely silent. 40 armed men behind Herath, 20 in Vaelor's escort. The cold morning light on cold stone and the smell of coal smoke and the distant, oblivious sound of the city going about its business a few blocks away. This is the moment that separates men who believe in power from men who are merely impressed by it. Herath had spent 11 years in proximity to an emperor and had mistaken understanding the machinery of power for possessing it. These are not the same thing. You can learn every gear and lever of a system and still find, in the moment of critical test, that the system recognizes who built it and responds accordingly. The men behind Herath were Nareth's soldiers. They wore its crest. Some had served under Vaelor for a decade or more. Herath had recruited them through the administrative channels he controlled, had positioned them here through the authority his office granted him. But administrative authority and genuine loyalty are different animals. And in this street at this moment, with the Emperor 12 inches away, and looking at them with the particular absolute focus of a man who is recording every face, those animals were separating. Seris could see it happening, could see it in the postures of the men in the back rows, the infinitesimal weight shifts of soldiers deciding that a chancellor's confidence was not the same as an emperor's authority, and that they would prefer to be on the right side of that distinction. Herath saw it too. His jaw tightened once. The composed face did something complicated and then smoothed again, and in that smoothing, Seris saw a man closing a door on the version of this that he'd built, folding it away with the practiced efficiency of someone who has been managing his own losses for a very long time and has learned to do it quickly. "I will walk," he said. Captain Dale moved forward. Herath did not look at Seris as he passed. He looked straight ahead, his composure rebuilt into something functional, if not intact. A man carrying the specific dignity of someone who has lost and refused to lose visibly. She watched him go and felt nothing in particular, which was more accurate than feeling contempt would have been. He was not a villain in the simple sense. He was a person who had looked at the structures around him and made the calculations available to him, and arrived at the conclusion that the structures existed to be wielded by whoever was willing to wield them most effectively. He had been wrong. in the end, about the depth of others' loyalty and the speed of his emperor's response. But the error had been one of information, not of a fundamentally different species of human motivation. That was somehow the most unsettling thing about it. The soldiers behind him looked at each other, then at Vaelor. Then, with the practical unanimity of men who have resolved an internal question, several of them stood down. Others followed. The formation dissolved, not dramatically, but with the quiet deflation of a structure whose organizing principle has just been removed. Vaelor watched it happen without visible satisfaction. He turned his horse back toward Seris and Caelen. His face was controlled and his eyes were direct, and there was something in them that hadn't been there 3 days ago. Or perhaps something that had been there always and had been too deeply buried under the architecture of imperial composure for her to locate until this moment. A rawness. The specific rawness of a man who has spent a very long time constructing the version of himself that was capable of surviving this life and has just, in the space of 3 minutes, been asked to demonstrate that the construction was real rather than performed. She thought, he is afraid. Not of Herath, not of the soldiers, of her, of Caelen, of what he has to become in order to deserve what he is trying to claim. She held his gaze. "We still have to enter the palace," she said. "Yes, and there will be others in there who sided with him." "Yes, and the council will need to be addressed within the hour." She looked at the palace gates ahead, the black stone and silver fire of it, the structure built to remind the world that mercy had never forged an empire. She had walked out of those gates 4 years ago with a purse she hadn't kept and a secret she had kept instead, and she had built an entire life in the distance between that gate and the mountains. She thought, "I am going back through the thing that nearly broke me." She thought, "I am not the same person who left." She thought, "Neither is he," or the next few minutes were the greatest performance she'd ever witnessed, and she intended to find out which. She looked at Caelen. He was looking at the gates. His small face was serious and very still, in the way that children's faces get when they are measuring something they don't have language for yet. "Caelen," she said. He looked at her. "It's going to be loud and complicated in there. There will be a lot of people. Some of them might say things that are confusing. If anything happens that feels wrong, you tell me immediately. You don't be polite about it. You tell me." He looked at her with those eyes. "Are we going to be okay?" She looked at Vaelor. Vaelor looked at Caelen with an expression she was not going to be able to think about directly for some time. The expression of a man looking at his son in full knowledge of what that word meant, all the weight and responsibility and terrifying love of it, for the first time with nothing between him and the reality of it. "Yes," Vaelor said, to Caelen, directly. "You're going to be okay. I give you my word." Caelen looked at him for a long moment with the ancient, unsettling directness of those eyes. "Okay," he said. The simplicity of that trust landed on every adult in the vicinity with the weight of something that didn't require commentary. They rode forward. The palace gates opened. Inside, the grand courtyard was lined with court members who had clearly been assembled for this moment. Not by Herath's order, those orders were already voided, but by the Empire's own protocol, the machinery of state welcoming its emperor home, whether or not the Empire's interior politics were currently in the process of detonating. Hundreds of faces, court officials, administrators, military officers, nobles from the great houses whose expressions ranged from genuine relief to careful neutrality to the specific, controlled tension of people who had backed a position this morning that was no longer the winning position. They were all looking at Seris, and they were all looking at Caelen. She felt the weight of it like a physical thing, not hostile, not exactly, but enormous. The full mass of an institution encountering something it hadn't been prepared to process. She kept her chin level and her eyes forward, and she breathed, and she did not let the weight move her. Vaelor dismounted in the center of the courtyard. He offered his hand to Caelen first. The boy looked at the hand, then at the assembled court, then at his mother. She gave him a small nod. He took Vaelor's hand and slid down from the horse, and when he hit the ground, he stood straight, instinctively, with the bearing of someone whose blood understood audiences even if his conscious mind had never encountered one. A murmur moved through the assembled court. She could not hear individual words. She didn't need to. Vaelor lifted his head and looked at his court, and when he spoke, his voice carried the full reach of a man who had been projecting authority into large spaces for 2 decades, and who did it now without the armor she'd seen him deploy every other time she'd observed him in this mode. "This is my son," he said, "Caelen Vaelor Drax. His mother is Seris Vale, who will stand beside him in Nareth with the full standing of a consort. Any question of legitimacy will be answered through the formal acknowledgement process that I will convene this afternoon." He paused. "And anyone in this court who took action against either of them under any authority other than mine, or who intends to, should understand that my attention is fully available for that conversation." The courtyard was silent. A long silence, the kind that fills with the sound of a great many people recalculating simultaneously. Then, from somewhere in the assembled crowd, Seris could not see who, would never know who, a single pair of hands came together. Then another. Then the sound spread, unevenly and with the uncertain quality of people following a lead they hadn't expected to be given, building into something that was not triumph and was not capitulation, but was perhaps the specific sound of an institution encountering a decision it hadn't made and finding, against its expectations, that it could absorb it. Vaelor looked down at Caelen. Caelen was watching the crowd with wide eyes, and the focused, cataloging attention he brought to everything new. "Why are they doing that?" Caelen said. "Because it's expected," Vaelor said. "But why?" Vaelor looked at him for a moment. "Because in this place, the way you show that you understand something is to make noise about it." He crouched down to the boy's level, right there in the center of the imperial courtyard, with hundreds of eyes on them. "You don't have to make noise about anything you don't understand yet. Ask me first." Caelen looked at him with those eyes. "And you'll actually tell me?" "Yes. Even if it's complicated. Especially if it's complicated." The boy considered this with the seriousness of someone entering a contract. Seris stood 2 feet away and watched them and felt the full weight of 4 years and every choice she'd made inside them. The survival and the silence and the fierce tectonic love of raising this child alone in a mountain valley, while the man crouching in front of him right now wore his empire like a shell and told himself it was protection. She felt the weight of all of it, and she felt something else too. Something she had not given herself permission to feel in 4 years, because feeling it would have required acknowledging that it had survived something she'd told herself it hadn't survived. She was not sure yet what to do with that. She was not sure yet whether the man in front of her was what he appeared to be in this moment, or whether this was the most elaborate and high-stakes performance she'd ever witnessed. She was not sure, and she was standing in the center of the imperial palace of Nareth, and in approximately 40 minutes, Vaelor had told her the council would assemble for a formal acknowledgement proceeding, and there would be members of that council who had supported Herath and who were now containing their panic inside formal court decorum, and at least 2 of them would move against the acknowledgement with every procedural tool available, and Vaelor would need to meet each one in real time. And she was about to find out whether the man who had just cleared a street of soldiers and sent his chancellor to a tower was capable of the more sustained, more difficult, less dramatically satisfying work of actually changing an institution from the inside. That was harder than confrontation. That was the work that took years and required the willingness to be uncomfortable indefinitely and to keep choosing the harder thing when the easier thing was always available. The clapping was fading. The court was beginning to move with the purposeful shuffle of a large group of people who have received significant information and are processing it through the medium of finding their next official obligation. Vaelor stood up. He looked at Seris. She looked back at him. Between them, Caelen had found a beetle on the courtyard stone and was crouching to observe it. Because he was 4 years old and the workings of political power were less immediately interesting than the workings of an insect, which was, Seris thought, the healthiest possible response to their current environment. "The council chamber in 40 minutes, Vaelor said. "I know. It will be contested. I know that too. Whatever happens in there." He stopped, moved through something in his jaw. "I need you to trust me in the room, not completely, not without condition, but enough to let me move first and explain after. There are people in that room who will use any hesitation between us as an opening." She looked at him for a long time. There are moments when a person is asked to make a decision that is not really a decision, when the options have reduced to one, and the question is only whether you will acknowledge that reduction or spend energy pretending it hasn't happened. She had made real decisions in the last week. She had decided to meet him. She had decided to listen. She had decided to return. She had decided to walk through the gates. What he was asking for now was the thing that came after all the decisions. The thing that couldn't be given in advance and couldn't be earned in advance and had no guarantee attached to it and required handing over something she'd been holding on to for 4 years with both hands, because it was the only thing standing between her and the particular damage that could only be done by someone you'd already trusted once. She thought about Caelen looking at Vaelor and saying, okay. She thought about what it would mean if she asked her son to extend trust she herself refused to. She thought about the wall of stones in Eld Hollow. The base has to be wider. Use the biggest ones on the bottom. She thought about ground that moves and the choice between falling and walking. She looked at Vaelor Drax, and she made the last decision that was still actually a decision, the one that everything else would be built on or broken by. And the making of it felt like stepping off something solid into something she couldn't yet see the bottom of. "Don't make me regret it," she said, and she walked toward the council chamber. And he followed. And the 40 minutes before everything broke open or held together stretched ahead of them like the thinnest possible bridge over the longest possible fall, and below it the full machinery of Empire waited to see which of them would blink first, and neither of them intended to, and the weight of everything that had been building since a winter night 4 years ago, when a purse had hit a woman's palms like an insult forged in gold, was about to land somewhere permanent. The door opened. They went in. The council chamber of Nareth was built to intimidate. That was not an accident of architecture. It was the deliberate intention of the men who had designed it 3 generations before Vaelor was born. A room whose proportions communicated the smallness of individual people against the scale of institutional authority, whose long stone table and high-backed chairs and banked tiers of observer seating existed to remind everyone inside it that what happened here was larger than any single person's interests or feelings or capacity for resistance. The ceiling vaulted 30 feet overhead. The walls were dressed stone, cold, without ornament. The light came from iron chandeliers and narrow windows set high, so that the quality of it was always slightly insufficient, always asking something of your eyes, always making the faces across the table slightly harder to read. Seris walked in and felt the room do its work on her. She let it. Then she found her footing on the stone floor, and she stood straight and she looked at the assembled council with the direct, unhurried attention of a woman who had survived things this room's architects hadn't imagined. And the room stopped working on her. There were 14 council members. 7 wore the expressions of men who had backed the winning position this morning and were managing the specific relief of people who had not committed quite far enough to Herath's coalition to be irrevocably implicated. 4 wore expressions of careful neutrality that she read as genuine, pragmatists who followed power rather than ideology, and were currently observing where power was pointing. 3 wore expressions she recognized immediately as dangerous, the composed, watchful faces of men who had invested significantly in the alternative outcome and had not yet abandoned the belief that it might still be recoverable. She cataloged all of them. She did not look away from the 3. Vaelor took the head of the table. He did not invite her to sit. He did not need to. She chose her seat, the one to his immediate right that placed her inside the conversation rather than adjacent to it, and she sat with the specific intention of being present rather than decorative, and if anyone in the room wanted to object to that positioning. They understood immediately from her posture that the objection would require energy they might not want to spend. Caelen was not in the room. She had arranged for Captain Dael, whose loyalty she had now had enough evidence to provisionally trust, to keep him in the antechamber with the carved horse and a plate of whatever food the palace kitchen could produce in 10 minutes. She had kissed Caelen's forehead and told him she would be back soon, and he had looked at her with those eyes and said, "Okay," in the tone of a child who meant, "I trust you," and was aware of what that trust cost. That look was sitting behind her sternum like a coal as she pulled her chair in. Vaelor opened without ceremony. He did not do preamble when he was operating in this mode. She had observed that about him in the palace years ago, the way he moved straight to the substance of things in council settings, as if warm-up language were a tax he refused to pay. He laid out the situation in precise, sequential terms. Herath's actions, the evidence for them, the formal removal in its grounds, the acknowledgement proceeding that was about to take place, and the terms under which it would be conducted. His voice was even, and his delivery was fast, and he left no space in it for the kind of procedural interjection that was the primary weapon of men who wanted to slow a process without appearing to oppose it. The three dangerous ones waited. Lord Fenwick, silver-haired, the oldest man at the table, whose family had held a council seat for 4 generations, and who operated from the specific position of someone who had watched emperors come and go and considered institutional permanence the only meaningful authority, waited until Vaelor had completed his framing, and then said, in the measured tone of a man who had never once in his life raised his voice because he had never needed to, "The formal acknowledgement of an unverified heir requires a genealogical review process of no less than—" "We're not doing the review process," Vaelor said. Fenwick's eyes moved to him. "The Charter of Succession is explicit that the Charter of Succession exists to prevent false claims to the bloodline. It is a verification mechanism. I am the verification. I am standing in this room telling you the child is mine." Vaelor held the older man's gaze without accommodation. "You can insist on the process and spend 4 months giving every interested party in this empire a window to complicate the situation, or you can accept my word and we can move forward today. I'll remind you that the Charter also gives me the authority to waive the genealogical review in cases where paternity is asserted directly by the sitting emperor." A pause. "That provision was intended for exactly this. Tell me what it was intended for, if not this." Fenwick closed his mouth. The second dangerous one, Lord Parev, younger, with the specific energy of a man whose ambitions had recently suffered a structural collapse and who was using formality as a container for what would otherwise be visible anger, leaned forward. "The question of the consort's standing is distinct from the question of the heir's acknowledgement. The Council has a role in determining the appropriateness of— The Council advises on appointments to formal offices of state." Seris said it before she'd made a conscious decision to speak. Her voice was level and carried exactly as far as it needed to and no further. A consort's standing is not an appointment to a formal office of state. It is a personal designation made by the Emperor. The Council's advisory role does not extend to the Emperor's household arrangements. Parev looked at her. She held his gaze with the specific, unmoving quality of someone who has already decided that being looked at is not the same as being diminished by it. "You know the Charter," he said. "I learned a great deal while I was a palace attendant." She did not inflect the last 2 words with anything. She did not need to, including how to read it. Something moved in the room. Not laughter. This was not a room or a moment for that, but the specific quality of air that shifts when a dynamic has been unexpectedly recalibrated and the people watching are adjusting to the new geometry. Parev sat back. He looked at Vaelor. Vaelor looked at him with the expression of a man who has decided to let what just happened stand without commentary, which was itself a form of commentary. The third dangerous one had not spoken yet. Lord Dre, mid-40s, with the contained, watchful quality of someone who thought in longer arcs than anyone else in the room, and whose silences were therefore the most productive silences at the table. He had been watching everything: Seris, Vaelor, the other council members, the distribution of energy in the room, with the patient attention of a man running calculations. He spoke now, and when he did not address the procedural questions. He looked directly at Seris. "You left this palace 4 years ago," he said. "You chose not to inform the Emperor of the child's existence. You built a life elsewhere under circumstances you controlled entirely. You are now, under a certain reading, returning to a position of significant institutional power over people who had no say in your absence or your return." He paused, not for effect, because he was genuinely constructing something. "I am not challenging the acknowledgement or the standing. I am asking for the record, and because I think the question deserves to be asked openly, whether you believe you have earned the trust this room is being asked to extend to you." The chamber was very still. This was, Seris recognized, the most honest thing that had been said in the room since she'd walked in. She could have answered it defensively. She could have answered it with the procedural certainty she'd used on Parev, or with the quiet authority she'd been maintaining since she sat down. Both would have worked as deflections. She chose not to deflect. "No," she said. Dre waited. "I haven't earned it," she said. "I made choices and circumstances that were forced on me, and some of those choices had costs for people who weren't the ones who forced the circumstances." "That's true." She held his gaze. What I can tell you is what those choices were made of. They were made of the judgment that the only person I was obligated to protect with complete unconditional priority was my son. Everything else was secondary. I make no apology for that hierarchy." She paused. "What I will tell you is that I'm aware trust here is not mine to claim. It will be extended or not based on what I do in this room, and the next one, and the one after that. I intend to do the work. Whether that earns what you're being asked to extend is a conclusion I'll leave to the people drawing it." Dre looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Vaelor. "She'll do," he said, which was, coming from Dre, apparently the highest available commendation, because two of the neutrals let out breath they'd been holding. Vaelor said nothing. But Seris saw something in his face that she had not seen there before. The specific expression of a man who is watching someone he'd underestimated in the wrong direction demonstrate exactly what they are, and who is absorbing the full measure of what he'd had access to and discarded, and what it had taken to get it back. The acknowledgement proceeding took 45 minutes. It was not clean. Fenwick contested 3 points of charter language, each time finding the provision he'd reached for already addressed by Vaelor's preparation, which meant the preparation had been thorough and had proceeded this morning, which meant Vaelor had been working on this longer than the last 4 days. She filed that without drawing a conclusion from it yet. Parav attempted twice to introduce the question of a genealogical review through different procedural framings, and was turned back both times. Several of the neutral members asked questions that were genuinely procedural rather than obstructive, and those Vaelor answered directly and Seris answered twice, and by the end of it the acknowledgement was on the record. And Caelen's standing was formally established, and the room had the particular quality of a space that has discharged something it had been holding under significant pressure. When it was over and the council members were filing out, Dre paused at the door. He looked back at Vaelor. "Herath will need to be processed through the full tribunal," he said. "The council will expect it to be transparent." "It will be," Vaelor said. Dre nodded. His eyes moved to Seris one more time. Whatever he was looking for, he apparently found it, because he turned and left without additional comment. The room emptied until it was only the two of them. Seris looked at the long stone table and the high cold ceiling and the insufficient light, and she breathed. "You prepared for Fenwick's charter arguments," she said. "Yes." "Before we arrived, you knew which provisions he'd reach for." "I've been in rooms with Fenwick for 9 years." "That's not what I'm saying." She looked at him. "I'm saying you prepared for this proceeding before you knew whether I'd agree to come back, before we had that conversation in Eld Hollow." She held his gaze steadily. "You were planning this before the market." The silence was honest. She gave him credit for that. He did not try to manage it. "Yes," he said. "Tell me what that means." He stood at the far end of the table with his hands flat on the stone, and he looked at her with the expression of a man who has arrived at the moment where there is nothing left to manage and only the truth available, which was, she suspected, an experience he had not had many times in his adult life and was not entirely comfortable with. "I received intelligence about a child in Eld Hollow 7 months ago," he said. "Unconfirmed. A reference in a trade registry, a timing that matched, a name that—" He stopped. "I told myself I wasn't certain. I told myself the intelligence could be wrong. I spent 4 months not acting on it." "But you didn't dismiss it." "No. And then you acted on it." "I came to see. I told myself I was coming to see. I told myself if it wasn't—" He pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose, the gesture she'd seen at the guest house, the gesture of a man managing something internal that was giving his usual tools a difficult time. "I prepared the acknowledgement proceedings 3 weeks before I rode to Eld Hollow, because I already knew. And because even if I hadn't known, I had already decided that if there was a child, I was not going to approach the situation the way I'd approached everything else in my life." He looked up. "I was not going to arrive and take. I was going to arrive and ask." She stood with that. The stone room held the silence. There is a specific kind of accounting that happens between people who have genuinely harmed each other and are attempting, without guarantee, to determine whether anything functional can be built on the ground where the harm occurred. It is not forgiveness. Forgiveness is a different process and moves on a different timeline and cannot be produced by decision the way other outcomes can. It is closer to a recalibration of what is being measured. A decision to stop measuring the past and start measuring what is actually present, while retaining the right to revise the measurement if the evidence requires it. Seris was doing that accounting. She thought about the purse, the weight of it, the particular humiliation of being handed something that said, "You are a problem I have solved," when what she had been was a person who had seen something in him that he was afraid to be seen. She thought about 4 years of mountain winters and hard work, and Caelen's laugh, and Mayleen's coffee, in the pre-dawn dark, and the life she had built out of nothing in the way that people who have been reduced to nothing build lives. From the bottom, with the largest pieces first, with a base wide enough to hold everything that came after. She thought about a man crouching in a frost-hard field to teach a 4-year-old how to stack stones. She thought about him standing over a child who was terrified in a room in Eld Hollow and saying, "You're going to be okay, I give you my word," in the voice of someone who understood the gravity of what a word meant when given to a child. She thought about what it cost to become different than what you'd been trained to be, what it required. She knew something about that from her own history, the training that palace life applied to servants, the systematic diminishment that was supposed to become internal, the way a person learned to make themselves small because the alternative was being made small by force. She had refused that training, not without cost. The refusal had its own costs, and she'd paid them. Vaelor had been given a different training, but the mechanism was similar, systematic, deliberate, applied over decades by an institution that required him to become something specific in order to function, and that punished the alternatives until they stopped presenting themselves. He had complied, and compliance, applied long enough, becomes indistinguishable from character unless something happens that forces the distinction. She had been what happened, and Caelen had been what happened, and the question was whether what those things had forced into the open was permanent or situational. Whether the man who had cleared a street and sat with a boy in a field and prepared acknowledgement proceedings in advance was the actual architecture of him, or whether it was a temporary configuration produced by circumstances and not robust enough to survive the return of comfort. She did not know the answer. She was not going to know it today. That was, she understood, exactly what trust required. Proceeding without the answer, on the basis of what was present rather than what was guaranteed. Trust was not certainty dressed in warmer clothing. Trust was the decision to act as though something were reliable before you had proof that it was, and to hold yourself ready to revise if the evidence demanded it. She was capable of that. She had not always been. The version of her that had walked out of this palace 4 years ago had been capable of survival, but not of this. The more sophisticated and more costly version of it that required holding both the damage and the possibility of what came after it in the same hands without letting either one crush the other. 4 years of raising Caelen had taught her that. She looked at Vaelor across the long stone table. "I'm not going to tell you I've forgiven you," she said. "That's not where I am, and I won't lie to you about where I am. What I will tell you is that I'm here. I'm going to be here tomorrow. I'm going to work at this, not because you've earned it, not yet, but because my son deserves to be raised by people who are trying to be better than their worst moments." She paused. "And because I think you actually are trying. I think it's real. I reserve the right to revise that if you give me reason to." Bryn Motzenkoten. He held her gaze the way he held everything now, without the imperial composure, without the management, just directly. "That's more than I have a right to," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." She moved toward the door. "Seris." She stopped. "I know I've said this before, or close to it, and I know what that costs coming from me." His voice was very quiet. "But I need to say it plainly, one time, in this room, on the record of whatever we're building." He waited until she turned to look at him. "I dismissed you because you were the first person in 20 years who made me feel something I couldn't manage. I turned that into a threat. I handled the threat the way I'd been trained to handle threats. And I have understood, with increasing clarity, for 4 years exactly what that cost. Both of us." He did not look away. "I'm sorry. Not for what it means to your forgiveness, for what it is, on its own, without transaction." She looked at him. She thought about what it meant for a man like Vaelor Drax to say, "I am sorry," and mean it as an end in itself, rather than a mechanism toward something else. She thought about what it had cost him to learn the difference. She thought about Caelen in the antechamber with his carved horse and his father's eyes and his mother's instincts, and the long, complicated life ahead of him that was going to require both. "I know," she said. She opened the door. They brought Caelen each in from the antechamber and walked the three of them through the palace corridors in the particular quality of afternoon light that came in through the high windows at this hour, cutting gold and cold across the stone floors. And it was nothing like any arrival Seris had imagined for this place. Not triumph, not vindication, not the clean resolution of something that had never been clean. It was more ordinary than any of those. More real. Caelen walked between them and held Seris's hand, and after a moment reached his other hand sideways toward Vaelor without looking up. The instinctive, practical gesture of a small child navigating unfamiliar terrain who has decided that available hands should be used. Vaelor's hand closed around his without hesitation. The three of them walked down the corridor. The palace made its sounds around them. Distant voices, the movement of the household, the particular resonance of large stone spaces inhabited by many people. Caelen's boots made small, decisive sounds on the floor, and he looked at everything with those enormous eyes, and occasionally pointed at something and asked about it with the relentless, systematic curiosity that had been his primary mode of engaging with the world since he could form sentences. "What's that?" "A portrait of my father," Vaelor said. "What was he like?" A pause. "Hard." Caelen considered this. "Are you hard?" "I was." Another pause. "I'm working on being something else." The boy tilted his head with the expression of a child assessing whether this answer was sufficient. "What are you working on being?" Vaelor looked down at him. The late light caught the angle of his face, and for just a moment she could see clearly what he would look like in 30 years. The same bones, the same directness, but with whatever accumulated weight the next 3 decades put on it. She hoped the weight would be different from what the last 2 decades had built in him. She intended to be part of ensuring that it was. "Someone worth trusting," Vaelor said. Caelen thought about this with the gravity he brought to everything that struck him as genuinely important. Then, "That takes a long time." "I know. Malin says you have to show people the same thing a lot of times before they know it's real." "Malin is right." "I'll watch," Caelen said with the matter-of-fact authority of a 4-year-old issuing a fair warning, and went back to looking at the portrait. Seris felt something move through her that was too large and too particular to name. It was not quite happiness. Happiness was too simple a word for something built on this much complexity. It was more like the specific quality of light that comes after a long storm, when the clouds have moved and the world is sharp and cold and completely present, and you are aware of every detail of it. The smell of the wet stone, and the way the light lies on ordinary surfaces, and the specific temperature of the air against your face. And you are aware, without knowing exactly what to do with the awareness, that you are still here, that you have come through the thing, that the ground is holding. She thought, this is not an ending. This is a beginning that has earned itself. She thought about Eld Hollow, about Malin's kitchen and the pre-dawn coffee, and the particular silence of a mountain morning when the frost was on the grass and the day had not yet declared itself. She would go back. Not to stay. That chapter had closed in the way that necessary things close, completely and without the option of reopening. But to go back and to stand in that kitchen and to tell Malin what the ground had held, because Malin had asked her to do exactly that when she'd said, "I will take care of him if it isn't fine." It was fine. Not clean, not without damage, not without the ongoing work of 2 people trying to become adequate to what they were attempting. But fine in the way that things forged under significant pressure are fine. Harder in the places that had broken, carrying the evidence of the breaking, not pretending the breaks hadn't happened. She thought about what she would tell Caelen when he was old enough for the whole story. She would tell him all of it, the palace and the corridor and the library and the purse and the road south and the mountain winters and the market and the field and the council chamber and what it had cost and what it had required and what it had produced. She would not sanitize it and she would not dramatize it. She would tell it the way it was, which was the only way she knew how to tell anything. She would tell him that power is not a shield. She had learned that in the space between the palace gates and the mountains of Eld. Power is a pressure, and what it reveals is not who you wish you were, but who you actually are when the pressure is applied. Some people harden and crack. Some people learn to move with the pressure rather than against it. and that learning is what survival actually looks like. Not dominance, not control, not the elimination of everything that can be used against you, but the ongoing, unglamorous, frequently painful work of remaining a person inside the machinery of what you've become. She would tell him that his father had learned that, late and at significant cost, but learned it. She would tell him that learning is not nothing. She would tell him that it might, in fact, be everything. The corridor opened into the west wing where the apartments had been prepared. She had conditions about those too, separate spaces until she decided otherwise, and those conditions had been met without argument. And the late afternoon light was coming in through the windows now at full force, gold and cold and completely honest, the way light is always honest, regardless of what it illuminates. Caelen stopped walking and turned to face the nearest window. He put his free hand on the glass and looked out at the capital of Nareth spread below. The rooftops and the streets and the distant walls, and beyond them the plains running south toward the mountains he'd spent his whole life looking at from the other side. "It's big," he said. "Yes," Seris said. "Are we going to learn all of it?" She looked at the city. She looked at Vaelor, standing still in the window light with his son's hand in his, wearing the expression of a man who has arrived somewhere he didn't believe he was going to reach, and is not yet sure what to do with the arrival. "That's the idea," she said. Caelen pressed his nose against the glass and looked. And the city went about its life below, vast and complicated and entirely indifferent to the particular weight of what had just settled in this corridor. A woman who had survived abandonment standing in the place that had caused it. A man who had spent 20 years building walls against his own tenderness, standing in the rubble of them, and a boy between them who knew nothing of what any of it had cost, who held their hands with equal, uncomplicated confidence, who had his father's eyes and his mother's clarity and belonged entirely to whatever came next. The instinct to dominate builds kingdoms. The willingness to be accountable is what makes them worth living in. Vaelor Drax, Emperor of Nareth, had spent the first half of his life learning the first truth and nearly destroyed everything that mattered to him in the process. He would spend the rest of it learning the second, one uncertain day at a time, in the company of a woman who had already known it, and a son who was only now beginning the long education of living. It was not a clean resolution. It was not a complete one. But it was the only kind of resolution that is actually real. The kind built not from the elimination of difficulty, but from the decision to face it together, and to keep facing it, and to refuse the easier option of hardening against it, and to understand finally in the bones rather than only the mind, that what survives the crown is not the crown. It is what was worth protecting all along. Caelen took his nose off the glass and looked at both of them. "Can we eat now?" he said. And Seris laughed. "The real kind, the kind that comes without warning and carries in it the full weight of everything that preceded it, and the specific relief of still being capable of it after everything." And the sound of it moved through the corridor and was gone, and the light shifted, and below them the city kept its ordinary life, and the three of them walked toward whatever came next.